Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. Every town has a dark side. The overlook at Harper's Ferry National Park was just another stop on Police Deputy Clark Jackson's early morning patrol route. A scenic viewpoint where tourists would go during the day to photograph the misty mountains of Virginia, or even use it as a jumping-off point for a day of hiking. But back in the spring of 1996, in the gray light of dawn, this peaceful overlook changed into something else entirely. It became the backdrop for a bizarre and unique murder scene, with the case spanning another decade before it was solved. And when it was all said and done, it showed the world what true evil looked like, and I promise you, it's a face you wouldn't expect. It revolves around a trunk in the middle of the Appalachian Trail, and the body found inside of it, and the dark investigation that followed. So let's head on down to Virginia now, and get into the mystery of the old man in the trunk. In Loudoun, Virginia, May 14th of '96 started off with the usual routine for Sheriff's Deputy Clark Jackson. He had been doing this route for 3 years now, and every morning and around dawn, the same sequence. Check the Visitors Center at Harper's Ferry National Park, and do a sweep of the parking lots, inspect the overlooks. In most days, the only signs of life out there were the occasional deer or early morning hikers prepping for a walk along the trails. But this morning was different, and as it turns out, it was anything but the usual. As Jackson's patrol car rounded the curve towards the Route 340 overlook, his headlights flashed past something that didn't belong. It was a large steamer trunk, old-fashioned, the kind you might find in your grandmother's attic. It seemed very out of place there, perched on the edge of the wilderness next to some trash cans. In 13 years of law enforcement, Jackson had seen plenty of illegal dumping, but something about this felt all wrong. The trunk looked too expensive, and too nice to simply just abandon. Jackson put the car in par, and stepped out of his cruiser. With his flashlight beam cutting through the fog, it illuminated the trunk's weathered leather, its brass fittings dulled with age. When he tried to move it with his foot, the trunk wouldn't budge, and that's when the first real surge of unease hit him, and whatever was inside was far too heavy to just be abandoned luggage. Jackson knelt down and unlatched the trunk, and inside was a large duffel bag crammed awkwardly into the space. He reached for the zipper, pulling it back slowly, and in the harsh beam of his flashlight, a single human eye stared back at him through the opening, lifeless. As he fully unzipped the bag, the full horror revealed itself. The stuffed away, like discarded garbage, was the body of an elderly man, and the victim had been forced into the bag in a fetal position, his limbs contorted in an unnatural way to fit the confined space. He was emaciated, his skin drawn tight across his bones, almost beyond recognition. The sun was rising by the time more police arrived, and they then carefully extracted the body. In the morning light, the true extent of the victim's suffering became clear. His clothes were dirty and hung loose on his skeletal frame. His wrists showed signs of restraint, and every detail pointed to a slow, methodical kind of cruelty. The medical examiner would determine he hadn't been dead long, perhaps 48 hours at most, but his body told a story of prolonged suffering, a nightmare that had lasted much longer than just 2 days. Cuts and abrasions marked his skin, some old and partially healed, others fresh. A significant blow had been dealt to the back of his head, likely disorienting him in his final hours. It was his toxicology report, though, that revealed the most disturbing details. In his blood, they found high levels of sedatives, enough to keep him docile, helpless, at the mercy of whoever had put him in that trunk. This, it appeared, wasn't a sudden act of violence at all, as someone had systematically broken this man down, mentally and physically, before finally putting him in that trunk. In the days following the discovery, investigators found themselves in a frustrating position. They had a body, they had a crime scene, but they had absolutely nothing that could tell them who this man was. No wallet, no letters, no receipts, not even a scrap of paper in his pockets. And so, the investigation team had to start with the basics to try and get a hit. They ran his fingerprints through every database they had access to. Local police records, nothing. State criminal records, nothing. FBI database, complete silence. It was starting to feel like this man had never existed in any official capacity at all. They tried DNA testing next, but this was 1996, and DNA technology was still new and limited. The samples they collected just weren't enough to work with, and the science that would later solve so many cold cases simply wasn't there yet. Next up, the team expanded their search, digging through missing persons reports. They figured if he was systematically broken down, as it had appeared over a long period of time, maybe somebody was looking for him, a spouse perhaps, or a child. They started with Virginia, then expanded to Maryland and West Virginia. Day after day, they compared photos, checked descriptions, and followed up on possible matches. Every lead went nowhere. Every potential match fell apart under scrutiny. They then looked at the trunk itself. Maybe something about it could tell them where it came from or where it had been. Just one piece of physical evidence stood out on that front, though at the time it seemed almost ridiculous. They were these small stains on the outside of the trunk. Splashes of nail polish, pink and purple, dried long ago on the leather, the kind of marks you might find on any teenage girl's belongings. The crime scene photographers documented them anyway, taking close-up shots from every angle. It seemed like such a small, unimportant detail, something that would probably never matter, but those simple nail polish stains, those tiny splashes of color, would eventually crack the entire case wide open, though that would come much later. For now, they were just another dead end in a case that seemed to have nothing but dead ends. The case quickly captured national attention, and here was a murder victim, presumably somebody's father, grandfather, friend, and nobody seemed to be looking for him. No family members came forward to claim him, no concerned neighbors reported his absence, and someone had to be missing him, you'd think. People don't just disappear without anybody noticing, and whoever had put him in that trunk had done more than take his life. They had erased him, and they had systematically removed every trace of who he was. And so the case went cold for 7 long years. The old man in the trunk remained nameless, just an unclaimed body in the morgue, another unsolved case in the files. However, in January of 2003, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The Department of Defense granted the FBI access to its internal fingerprint database, and suddenly, Gondo had a name, Jasper Frederick Watkins. Known to his friends as Jack, Watkins was no ordinary victim. He was born on March 21st of 1920 in Richmond, Virginia. He was part of that generation of Americans who grew up during the Great Depression and who learned the value of hard work and helping others even when you had nothing yourself. Jack was barely 21 when he heard his country's call. He enlisted in the army just weeks before Pearl Harbor, not knowing that the world was about to change forever. Like so many young men of his generation, he traded his civilian clothes for a uniform and headed off to war. He would spend the next 4 years of his life fighting in World War II, witnessing humanity at its worst while displaying humanity at its finest. He survived one of history's deadliest conflicts and came home and built a life for himself, only to meet his end in a steamer trunk on a foggy Virginia morning. That's just no way for someone like Jack to end up, and he deserved much more than that. As investigators began to dig into Jack Watkins' life, they discovered something disturbing, but also could lead them right to the killer. Someone was still cashing his Social Security checks nearly 7 years after his death. Where they were sent to? A P.O. box in Ellicott City, Maryland. That's when the investigators began to uncover a story so twisted and calculated that it would challenge everything they thought they knew about evil. Because the person who killed Jack Watkins wasn't some random drifter or opportunistic thief. It was somebody he trusted, someone he had loved, and somebody who had spent decades perfecting the art of destruction. To understand how Jack ended up in that trunk, we need to go back a little, back to the moment when a lonely widower opened his door to find a friendly face selling burial plots, never suspecting that he was looking into the eyes of his future killer. After coming home from the war, Jack did what many veterans do. He looked for a steady job and a chance at a normal life. He found work at a local auto parts store, a local type of spa where people knew your name and trusted your word. It wasn't glamorous work, but Jack enjoyed it and took pride in what he did. He became the guy everyone in the neighborhood went to when they needed honest advice about their cars, and for years his life followed a simple routine: work, home, church on Sundays, all alone. But that changed in 1964 when he met Mary Triplett. She was a 40-year-old divorcee with 3 grown daughters, and something about her caught Jack's eye. Maybe it was her warm smile or the way she could make anyone feel at home. And whatever it was, 44-year-old Jack had finally found the love of his life. Mary's daughters weren't sure what to expect from their mother's new husband at first, but Jack won them over almost immediately. He didn't try to replace their father at all. He just showed up day after day with quiet support and genuine care. Before long, he was the one they called when they needed advice, the one who showed up to help them move and sat proudly at their graduations, and he became the father they never knew they needed. For 25 years, Jack and Mary built a nice life together. Their house wasn't fancy, but it was always open to family and friends. They weren't rich by any means, but they were comfortable. Jack had learned the value of $1 during the Depression, and he and Mary were careful with their money. They saved what they could, spent what they needed, and always had a little set aside for emergencies. Then in 1989, Mary got sick. The cancer moved fast, and within months she was gone. Jack was devastated. The house that had once been filled with family gatherings and laughter suddenly felt empty, but he was determined to keep going, just like he had done after the war. He retired, sold their family home, and bought a modest place in Reisterstown, Maryland. It wasn't much, just a small house on a quiet street, but it was enough for him. He lived simply on his Social Security check of $1,200 a month, clipped coupons from the Sunday paper, and kept his old car running with parts from his former store. But in 1995, Jack's spending habits changed dramatically, and the man who had always lived within his means suddenly withdrew equity from his house. He then purchased a brand new BMW for $44,000, an expense that seemed completely out of character. By 1996, he had sold his house, but somehow only received $3,800 from the sale. What could make a prudent, experienced man like Jack Watkins act so recklessly with his life savings? When investigators examined Jack's financial records, they found that it wasn't just that someone had taken his money. They had stripped him of everything he owned, and they had done it with surgical precision. The trail led to that P.O. box in Ellicott City and to a woman named Nancy Siegel. But Nancy wasn't just any fraudster. She was a chameleon, a master manipulator who had spent her entire adult life perfecting the art of deception. Born in 1948, Nancy's early life seemed marked by tragedy. Her mother abandoned the family when Nancy was young, and her father, who raised her alone, would go on to be killed outside a bar when she was just 16. Looking for an escape, she found brief fame dancing on the Buddy Dean Show, a local Baltimore dance program that would later inspire the musical Hairspray. But beneath the surface of this sympathetic figure lay something far more sinister. Nancy's first victim was her high school boyfriend, Charles Kircharski, whom she married in 1968. She devotes her time to raising them, and things go quite well for many years. In the early 80s, Nancy found herself gambling way too much, an addiction that would go on to reveal her true nature. I think underneath, it was controlling her more than she was controlling it. To make back some money, she started taking out loans and credit cards in her husband's name, and he didn't have a clue. She begins opening lines of credit in her husband's name. By the time they divorced in '85, he was $120,000 in debt and had no choice but to file for bankruptcy. He was victim number one. Nancy needed a new way to get cash flowing, so she married Ted Gesendaffer soon after, only to repeat the pattern. She used all his information to get loans, and even altered the mortgage payment checks to make them payable to herself instead of where they should go in case she needed to skim some cash from them. Both those marriages were just warm-ups for Nancy, though. Over time, she honed her craft, swiping mail, snatching wallets, and collecting people's personal info and driver's licenses, credit cards, social security numbers, you name it. Though she got arrested more than once, the charges were scattered across different towns, and so she never spent more than 2 weeks behind bars. And then, in November of '94, while selling burial plots door to door, Nancy crossed paths with the perfect victim in Jack Watkins. The lonely widower didn't stand a chance against her polished charm, and within weeks, he was telling everybody that they were engaged. They were decades apart in terms of their age, and quite different in terms of their lifestyle. And what followed was a master class in manipulation. Nancy had Jack take out over $60,000 in mortgages, and then she got a bunch of credit cards under his name to max them out in no time. She isolated him from family and friends, making him unavailable when they tried to check in on him. Nancy would intercept Jack's phone messages and never pass them along. But eventually, Nancy's plans were complicated by a new romance, and while stealing Jack's cash, Nancy then began romantically seeing Eric Siegel, a lone broker with a lot of money. And suddenly, Jack wasn't so important, and in fact had become a bit of a liability, somebody who could potentially expose her schemes. And since Nancy had never been one to leave loose ends, she began to plan. As a result, she had to do something with Jack. After forcing him to sell his home in April of '96, Nancy moved Jack into her house. What happened next was almost too cruel to comprehend. She began drugging him with sedatives and slowly started to starve him to death. In his final days at the age of 76, Jack was reduced to a shadow of himself. Within 48 hours of May 13th of 96, Nancy drove to Virginia and dumped Jack's body near some trash on an access point to the Appalachian Trail. The trunk she used belonged to one of her own daughters, and while she just dumped it there in the open is a major misstep for her. Perhaps she thought it would just get picked up along with the rest of the trash, like it was no big deal. But she didn't count on Deputy Jackson doing his rounds. The investigation into who Jack was began when Nancy moved on quickly, marrying Eric Siegel in December of '98. And true to form, she defrauded him of $300,000, and rather than report her to the authorities, Eric paid off her debts himself. When investigators finally caught up with Nancy in 2003, the whole puzzle started coming together. When the authorities discovered she had been the last person to be seen with Jack, she was the one who helped him sell his house, and she was the one who had convinced him to buy that expensive BMW. But instead of answering questions, she put on quite a show. As she burst into tears at the sight of photos of the trunk where Jack's body was found, and through her sobs she spun a complicated tale. According to her, she had been Jack's caretaker. She claimed he was like a father to her, and that he had been suffering from dementia. She even tried to convince them that he had in part done this to himself, and she found him hanging from a ceiling fan, and she didn't know what to do. A story that defied common sense, and sounded exactly like the kind of lie someone makes up when they're running out of options. Ultimately, the final nail that sealed Nancy's coffin came from the people who knew her best, her own daughters. And they knew all too well about their mother's criminal history, and she had even stolen their identities and ruined their credit, so they weren't exactly trying to help their mom get out of this. It was actually the perfect time for them to get a little bit of revenge. When shown a photograph of the trunk, one daughter immediately recognized it as her own, identifying it 100% by those little nail polish stains. In January of 2004, Nancy Siegel was indicted on multiple charges, including murder, theft of government property, identity theft, bank, wire, and mail fraud. Her trial started in 2009, and after 7 hours of deliberation, the jury found her guilty on 20 of 21 counts. That she would never rejoin society, and that there was justice in that. But the story of the old man in the trunk has one final chapter. In August of 2009, 13 years after his body was discovered in that lonely overlook, Jasper Jack Watkins received the dignity and debt that had been denied him in his final days. With full military honors, he was laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery, surrounded by representatives from every agency that had worked to bring his killer to justice. In the end, evil often hides right in plain sight, so be careful who you trust out there. And they're sitting across the table from you, mowing the lawn next door. And sometimes they're the ones selling burial plots to the very people they plan to kill. Okay, let's move on to the next case. Case 2. Even before cars were invented, young people sought out hidden areas for make-out sessions, and probably a little more. By the 1860s, these secluded spots for getting naughty would become known as lovers' lanes, where couples parked their horse-drawn buggies, seeking privacy from prying eyes. These places were typically visited by young couples who wanted to hide their activities because they were unmarried, which of course was heavily frowned upon then. Mothers used lovers' lanes as places to cheat on spouses in order to keep things on the down low. Over time, the buggies were replaced by cars, but lovers' lanes continued to attract those looking to lust. But this sinning and privacy would all come at a cost, because lovers' lanes everywhere quickly became the target for bad individuals looking to commit all sorts of crimes. Robbery, assault, and murder, because they knew that their targets would have their guards down, and because they were already in a secluded spot, no one would hear them scream. And tragically, Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson are among the many who visited a lover's lane only to never return, and this is their story. Cheryl was born in Florida on October 24th of 1967 to parents Robert and Barbara. Even as a child, she was good-natured, easygoing, and always loving. Her family says it was difficult to be down whenever she was around. Her infectious laughter had a way of brightening the lives of those around her. With wavy blonde hair and blue eyes, Cheryl's cheerful demeanor continued on as she grew older. The Henrys moved to the Houston area of Texas eventually, and in 1986, after graduating high school, Cheryl enrolled at Stephen F. Austin State University, about 150 miles north of her home. In 1990, at 22 years old. She then returned to Houston, where she found work as an optometrist while planning for her and her sister Shane, who was 3 years younger than her, to live together. In the meantime, she was staying with her mom, and it was that summer that Cheryl met Andy. Garland Andrew Atkinson, known to his friends as just Andy, was born to parents and in Garland on September 6, 1968, in North Carolina. Andy's folks were young at the time. His dad was 18 and his mom just 16, and shortly after his birth, the Atkinsons divorced, leaving him to be raised by his grandmother for much of his life. Despite this somewhat rocky upbringing, Andy was known to be a happy baby and child. Longing for a real sense of family, he grew up inseparable from his cousin Timmy. In 1977, Andy's father Garland relocated to Houston amid some legal troubles in North Carolina. Garland had gotten into trouble after accidentally shooting a man in the face during a fight that occurred at Rick's Lounge. The man survived and all charges were later dropped. It's worth noting so you understand a bit better the type of person Garland was, as it's possible to come into play later on in the case. Initially, Andy moved to Houston with his dad, but he decided he didn't want to stay and quickly moved on back to North Carolina. This was for the best, as not long after, his father found himself in trouble again with the law, and this time he was busted for dealing drugs. Garland spent the next several years in prison, where Andy made the trek to visit him once a month. Upon his release, Andy visited his father in Houston for weeks during summer break. Garland often asked Andy to move in with him permanently, but Andy wasn't interested in this, as he wanted to be with his friends back on the East Coast. During these summer visits with his dad, Andy worked the door at Dream Street, a club managed by his father, to earn some extra cash. Andy attended Campbell University in North Carolina for a few semesters. However, driven by a desire to connect back with his father, and perhaps seeing more opportunities out there, he headed out to Houston in early June of 1990. He began working at a Gold's Gym, enrolled at the University of Houston, and was due to start classes in early September. However, tragedy would strike before that would ever happen. In early August, Andy, along with a friend, decided to catch up at one of their usual night spots, a popular place called the Yucatan Liquor Stand. That particular night, one of Andy's buddies brought along a girl he was seeing, and she, in turn, introduced her friend. This friend was Cheryl Henry, and from their first encounter, both Cheryl and Andy were feeling the butterflies. Cheryl didn't usually get worked up over boys, yet here she was, utterly enamored with Andy. Her sister had never seen her so blissfully happy. Andy too fell hard, and the connection was instant. They were inseparable, each declaring the other as the one. Their bond grew fast, and was seemingly unbreakable. On the night of August 22nd, the couple in love headed out on the town on a double date with Cheryl's younger sister Shane and her boyfriend. They hit up Bayou Mama's, a nightclub right in the heart of Houston on South Gessner Road. They sipped some cocktails and shared a few laughs. Shane vividly remembers the affectionate exchanges between her sister and Andy, playfully teasing them and telling them to go get a room. And at around 11:30 p.m., they did exactly that. At least, sort of. After leaving the club, Cheryl and Andy set out for a secluded lovers' lane out in West Houston, a popular rendezvous spot for young couples seeking some cheap privacy. But after that night, well, neither of them would ever be seen alive again. Shane, who often drove her sister to work, stopped by her mother's house the following morning to pick Cheryl up, only to find no trace of her. Assuming she had simply stayed with Andy and had forgotten to let her know, Shane continued on with her day, brushing aside any sort of concern. But as the hours slipped away, the problems kept adding up. Cheryl failed to arrive at work altogether, which was very unlike her. Then no one could reach Andy, so by 5 p.m. on August 23rd, Cheryl's family reported her as missing to the Houston PD. Around that exact same time, a Cisco food security guard in the area of that lover's lane found Andy, his white Honda Civic, abandoned in an isolated cul-de-sac. Initially, that security guard wasn't alarmed, but when the car was still sitting there at 8 p.m. when he made his next set of rounds, he felt the need to investigate a bit further. As he approached, he noticed the windows were rolled down, which allowed him to get a clearer look inside. From there, he saw the key still sitting in the ignition, and the seats fully reclined. Scattered on the passenger's side floor were Cheryl's shoes and her purse. But what really grabbed his attention was what appeared to be some fresh bloodstains inside the vehicle. At that point, the guard contacted the police. After phoning them, he then decided to phone a number found in the purse. That number just happened to belong to Cheryl's mother, Barbara, and so she rushed to the wooded area, arriving long before the cops did. When police arrived upon checking the license plate, they learned that the vehicle belonged to Andy. Knowing the couple hadn't been seen since last night, they knew they had a problem on their hands. Officers armed with canines commenced a thorough search of the area. Barbara was never far behind. It was just before midnight on August 23rd when a cadaver dog led them to an utterly gruesome discovery. It was Cheryl's body around 200 yards away from Andy's car. Her death was so brutally violent that officers had to restrain her mother, shielding them from the horrific sight. Nearby, another unsettling discovery awaited. The killer had meticulously laid out Andy's golf clubs and balls from his trunk, forming a trail that pointed directly to Cheryl's location. The girl was found face down, naked, and covered with decaying cedar fence boards. Her clothing had been savagely cut away, her underwear stuffed into the pocket of her jeans. Her hands were bound heavily behind her back with hemp rope, and her throat had been slashed 3 times. Evidence of SA was confirmed with DNA samples collected from her remains. The golf clubs and balls weren't the only unusual piece of evidence investigators found at the crime scene. As suspended from a tree above Cheryl's body were 4 partially deflated balloons, and lying beside her was a crisp $20 bill. It appeared that the killer had enjoyed his time out there, setting up a macabre scene the likes of which these officers had never encountered, and he was toying with them. I'm concealing it, but not enough that you cannot find her. In other words, I want him to be found. A search for Andy was called off because it was just too dark, but it resumed at first light the following morning. After nearly 10 hours, they found him, bound to a tree 75 yards away from his girlfriend, and his throat had been cut so deep that he was nearly decapitated. Unlike Cheryl, Andy was discovered clothed, with his watch and money untouched. The killer's motive was clearly aimed at the victims, not their possessions, but the investigation begged the question, why did the murderer provide clues to Cheryl's whereabouts, yet none for Andy's? Examining the crime scene further, investigators believe that Andy willingly allowed his killer to tie him to that tree, perhaps by the threat of a gun. It was determined that the girl had been killed first, and she put up a fierce fight. That means that Andy was forced to endure the horror of hearing Cheryl's screams. Perhaps he thought they would get out of it at first if they just obeyed, but then he had to witness her murder, fully aware that he faced the same fate, at that point completely powerless to intervene. Their families and the town were devastated. The worst part of it all was that they didn't have any leads whatsoever, at least not back in 1990. At that time, DNA testing was in its infancy. Introduced only 5 years earlier, in 1985, it was not yet a common tool in criminal investigations. For the DNA sample collected from Cheryl's body even to be analyzed, permission had to be explicitly granted. By September of 1990, a $10,000 reward was announced for any information that could lead to the arrest of the perpetrator. Despite investigators' relentless pursuit of every lead, fairly quickly, months turned to years without any answers. It wasn't until 2001, 11 years after the crime, that a significant development emerged. In that year, the Houston Police Department received a letter claiming to have information about the murders, but they weren't looking to just be a good Samaritan and help solve the case. They were demanding $100,000 in exchange for the info. The public only learned of this letter 3 years later, in 2004. The handwritten note read, HBD, if you want to know who killed C. Henry plus A. Atkinson, it will cost you $100,000. Reply, Houston Chronicle personal column, Monday, March 12th, a one only. A lawyer will be hired to make sure you play straight. Postmarked March 1st of 2001, the letter arrived at the police station early that month, and the police replied with an ad, saying, we do want to know what you know about Henry and Atkinson. They included a contact number, hoping for a response, and despite their efforts, no one reached out. Was this merely a cruel hoax, an attempt at a cash grab? I mean, why wait over a decade to come forward if the sender truly had valuable information? In a desperate bid for leads, the police finally released the letter to the public in 2004, hoping someone might recognize something crucial. During the investigation up to this point, several potential suspects were identified. However, each was found innocent through DNA testing, and the letter never led anywhere. Then in 2007, all samples were retested, marking a very pivotal moment in a case that had long gone cold. As the retests revealed that DNA evidence from semen found in Cheryl's body actually matched DNA collected in the unsolved assault of the Houston exotic dancer. With DNA testing expensive and in its infancy, it would take 17 years before that sample was run. It turned out to be a match to the lover's late killer. This assault had occurred just 2 months prior to the murders of Cheryl and Andy, right around the time they first met. The victim, an employee at Gigi's nightclub in Houston, left work around 2 a.m. on June 20th, 1990, headed to her boyfriend's house in northwest Houston. With her boyfriend, Randy, who was a pilot away traveling, she was all alone. She ate a late dinner in the living room, unaware that likely an intruder was upstairs the entire time waiting for their moment. This man eventually emerged wearing a black fishnet stocking over his head, waving a long-barreled handgun. The woman froze in fear, and this guy demanded to know where Randy was, claiming that he owed him money. There was a brief pause, and then the intruder attacked. He grabbed her and wrapped her wrists tight with duct tape, and then pulled $200 from her purse, her pay for working that night, and stuffed it in his pocket. He then blindfolded and gagged her, and placed a pillowcase over her head and threw her onto the bed. Taunting her, he repeatedly cocked and uncocked the gun, acting like he was about to shoot her over and over again while he committed his heinous act. Another game, just like the golf clubs and balloons from the lover's lane case. Before leaving, he ordered her to remain on the floor and disconnected the phone. Despite wearing the stocking over his head, the victim provided a detailed description. The attacker was described as a white male in his late 20s to mid-30s, about 6 feet tall and weighing 180 pounds, black hair, and an olive complexion. He wore black gloves, a dark shirt and dark pants, possibly a uniform of some sort. His stance was described as very forceful, military-like. The victim helped generate this sketch of her attacker, which was also aged. Something else that stood out: he had a very forceful, military-type stance about himself. Although DNA was collected, testing was too new and costly, delaying the analysis for 17 years, only to find it matched the DNA found on Cheryl. The similarities in each case raised many questions. Could Cheryl and Andy have known their killer, as it appeared in the case of the exotic dancer that the perpetrator knew Randy, the boyfriend? Authorities speculated that the suspect likely frequented or worked at a local strip club, and when re-interviewed, the female victim actually disclosed that she had previously worked for Andy's father at the club that he managed. So was that just a coincidence, or was somebody perhaps out for revenge? In May of 2008, the police released a composite sketch of the perpetrator, based on the victim's description, aged to reflect how the attacker might look now. Yet despite these efforts, his identity still remains elusive. The DNA which links one individual to both crimes has not matched any profiles in any national databases, or any of the 23andMe type places either. It might be a matter of time before that happens, but also 34 years have passed, which is a long time. Today, the case remains unsolved, and the killer is still at large. But what have they been up to since then, and how has their life gone? I'm more bothered with just knowing what happened, who did it. I'm curious of what this person's been doing all their life, how they've been able to live with it every day. Fast forward 2 years after the infamous Lover's Lane murders to the night of August 4th of 1992, and Tammy Breckenridge, a 23-year-old waitress, vanished after leaving the men's club in Houston at around 1 a.m. The men's club was only a short distance from Bayou Mama's, and Tammy had been last seen talking to the security guard at the club. Unfortunately though, to this day, she's never been found, and no arrest for her abduction and likely murder has been made. Worth noting is that many other young women have also disappeared in Harris County, many in the early 90s, and they've never been found. Several of them were in their early 20s with blonde or brown hair. They were roughly the same height and the same weight, and all vanished in the early hours of the morning. While Houston is a large area, and it is possible they aren't related, you also can't deny that perhaps they are. And maybe there is a serial killer out there that's yet to have even been identified as a serial killer. Today, Cheryl and Andy's families remain tormented by all the unanswered questions in their case. While recent breakthroughs in familial DNA have illuminated countless cold cases across Houston and beyond, they have yet to cast light on the mystery of Cheryl and Andy's murders. So it's hard when people ask us if there's anything new, because for 33 years there hasn't been anything new. But somewhere out there, somebody holds the key to unraveling this sinister secret. That's the end of the second case. Let's move on to the next case. Case 3. In the middle of the night on a quiet September morning in 2015, piercing screams shattered the silence of a normally peaceful Bristol neighborhood. Neighbors peeked through their windows, shocked to see a man stumbling outside wearing only his underwear. His skin looked like it was covered in mud or dirt, but it would turn out to be neither. As neighbors tried to assist the frantic man, it didn't take long for them to realize that the dark substance on the man's skin was not mud. It was his own skin, disintegrating and falling off in clumps as he pleaded for help. The man was in unimaginable agony, and despite their efforts, there was little the neighbors could do to help him. Paramedics arrived, and even they marveled at the extent of the man's beyond harrowing condition. But it was only the beginning. The case would soon reveal the horrifying depths to which human cruelty could descend. Mark van Dongen was a Dutch national, born and raised in the Netherlands. Mark's father, Cornelius van Dongen, known by the common Dutch nickname Hees, described Mark as a compassionate child, recognized for his kindness, empathy, and ambition. Even as a young boy, Mark showed a tender heart, sometimes returning marbles to friends after winning them so they would not feel bad. In college, Mark studied civil engineering, where he excelled academically. He was ambitious and highly driven. He strived to succeed both academically and professionally. After completing his studies in the Netherlands, Mark relocated to Bristol, UK to continue his studies and start looking for work opportunities in his field. His move to the UK marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. It was during this new chapter that Mark met Berina Wallace, a fashion student from South Africa, nearly 20 years his senior. Mark and Berina began dating in 2010, and their relationship initially looked promising, with the pair quickly becoming close. They moved in with each other and seemed committed to building a life together, with Mark deeply invested in their relationship and even supporting Berina both emotionally and financially. But over time, problems arose as Berina started to become emotionally volatile and controlling. Mark's friends and family grew increasingly concerned as they witnessed Berlina's emotional manipulation and frequent outbursts of anger. The couple's arguments would escalate as Berina tried to control many aspects of Mark's life. Friends saw visible evidence of her violence, namely scratches on Mark's body, and learned that Berina had once poured boiling water on Mark as he slept. When he sought treatment for it, he told a doctor that he had accidentally tipped tea over himself. In private, he confided in friends that Berina had either hurt or threatened him on numerous occasions. Each time Mark would try to distance himself, Berina would resort to emotional blackmail, including threats of self-harm, trapping him between his desire to leave and concern for her well-being. Despite the turmoil, Mark stayed in their relationship for 5 years. By August of 2015, Mark had reached his breaking point. He decided it was time to break up with Berina. Seeking a fresh start, he met another woman named Violet Farquharson online, and they soon began a new relationship. But Berina did not let go so easily, sending Mark a series of emotional texts laced with guilt and threats. Mark tried to maintain peace by offering to continue supporting Berina financially even after their breakup, hoping to prevent her from spiraling further. But she continued to become even more volatile, and her jealousy turned into an obsession. She started stalking Mark and harassed both him and his new girlfriend with silent phone calls. Mark reported feeling fearful of Berina, particularly after she threatened to harm herself. According to one friend, she even threatened to perform that self-harm, then make it appear as though Mark was responsible. Mark confided in both his father and friends that he was afraid of what Berina might do next, but he also felt obligated to check on her periodically for both of their sakes. Then, in September of 2015, in an attempt to end things amicably once and for all, Mark visited Berlina's flat one final time. Mark told his new girlfriend Violet of his intentions to sever all ties with Berina, then headed to her flat around 10 p.m. Once he arrived, the conversation quickly turned heated. Berina refused to accept that Mark had moved on, clinging to their relationship despite his efforts to break things off. According to Violet, Berina told Mark that she would go stay at a hotel for the night, so Mark ended up staying the night at Berlina's. And not just at her flat, but in her bed. It was an odd narrative of events given Berlina's supposed plan to leave for a hotel, raising questions about Mark's account to Violet and the true nature of the evening. At around 3 a.m., as Mark lay asleep in just his boxer shorts, he was shaken awake by Berina. Startled, he woke up to Berina telling him that, "If I can't have you, no one will." Then, before Mark could react, Berina threw sulfuric acid directly onto his face, then onto his body. The liquid burned instantly, searing through his skin and muscles. Mark screamed in agony as he scrambled out of the bed in unbearable pain. Barely able to see, he stumbled out of the flat and into the street, his skin melting away in clumps. He screamed for help as voice-waking neighbors rushed to their windows. At first, they thought it was a prank. One neighbor thought the commotion was caused by wailing foxes, grabbed a golf club, and ran outside. Another neighbor initially thought Mark was covered in mud. To both of them, it became horrifyingly clear that it was a man in agony, and that his skin, not mud, was melting off of his body. Neighbors guided Mark into a nearby flat and put him in a cold shower, desperately trying to ease his pain. Despite their efforts, the damage was already done. When paramedics arrived, Mark was foaming at the mouth, blinded, and in unimaginable pain. One paramedic noticed that the iris of his left eye had been completely melted. To paramedics, it was obvious that Mark's injuries were catastrophic. His face and upper body were covered in deep chemical burns, with the acid eating through his skin and muscle tissue. Mark was barely able to speak through the pain, his words slurred as he gasped for air. His body convulsed from the shock, and acid residue still clung to parts of his skin, intensifying the damage with every second. Despite his agony, Mark managed to identify Berina as his attacker. He begged the paramedics to check on his new girlfriend, fearing that she might also be targeted by Berina. But she was not. His girlfriend was completely fine. In fact, Berina was still in her flat, sitting calmly, unmoved by Mark's piercing screams echoing through the neighborhood in the middle of the night. Instead of calling for help, Berina picked up the phone and called a friend, showing no sign of remorse whatsoever for the unbearable suffering she directly caused. The paramedics worked quickly, administering oxygen and pain relief to combat his labored breathing and stabilize him. As he was being rushed to the hospital, police officers arrived at the scene to investigate. They quickly gathered information from neighbors, who confirmed how Mark had identified Berina as his attacker. Their observations, combined with Mark's account to paramedics, gave police enough cause to act swiftly. They arrived at Berlina's flat and found her sitting calmly on the sofa, showing no visible signs of distress. Despite the chaos unfolding just outside her door, she remained indifferent, offering no assistance to the person she attacked. Officers noted her detached demeanor. They took her into custody, arresting her on suspicion of causing grievous bodily harm. Meanwhile, back at her flat, police collected the acid bottle she had used, which was now missing its original label, a clear indication of her intent to conceal what it contained. Law enforcement also seized Berlina's electronic devices, hoping to uncover evidence of premeditation. Berlina's behavior remained eerily calm throughout the initial stages of her arrest. As police began questioning her, she insisted that she had no idea the bottle contained acid, claiming instead that she thought it was water. Back at the hospital, the trauma team observed burns covering 25% of Mark's body, with many areas of exposed flesh already turning black. It was clear to the medical team that they were dealing with one of the worst acid attacks they had ever seen. As his condition deteriorated, doctors moved Mark to the intensive care unit, where he was placed into an induced coma to give his body a chance to stabilize and cope with the trauma. His left leg, already showing signs of poor circulation from the acid exposure, raised immediate concerns among the doctors. Meanwhile, police proceeded with their investigation. What they uncovered was weeks of meticulous planning and a disturbing state of mind leading up to the attack. Investigators spoke to Mark's friends and family, who provided insights into Berlina's volatile and manipulative behavior toward Mark, especially in the final months of their relationship, including the boiling water incident. They painted a relationship of escalating violence and control that culminated in the attack. They also gathered evidence of Berlina's own admissions to therapists that she had anger issues dating back as far as her teenage years, including her telling one psychiatric nurse the year before the attack that she gets an adrenaline rush when someone says the wrong thing to her, and that she feels like she could destroy everything around her when that occurs. Then there was the purchase of the acid. On September 2nd, Berlina ordered a bottle of 98% concentrated sulfuric acid from Amazon. After receiving it, she deliberately removed the label which stated that the acid causes severe burns and eye damage to conceal what the bottle contained. Law enforcement contended that she did so to prevent detection of the colorless substance, making it impossible for anyone unfamiliar with the contents to recognize it as sulfuric acid. A search of Berlina's electronic devices revealed that her choice of sulfuric acid was by no means random. In the weeks leading up to the attack, she had performed 82 searches related to sulfuric acid, visiting dozens of websites, including reading about the long-term injuries and physical damage inflicted on victims, and reviewing detailed case studies of previous attacks. The extent of her search history made it clear that the attack was not impulsive. It was carefully planned. And then there was the fact that Berina made no attempt, had no desire whatsoever to assist Mark after her brutal attack. As the acid instantly took effect and sent Mark into the most excruciating pain imaginable, Berina sat back and reveled in the suffering she caused, demonstrating to authorities her complete level of maliciousness and callousness to be able to ignore someone writhing in such excruciating agony. All the evidence led investigators to the conclusion that the attack was deliberate and premeditated, despite Berlina's claim to the contrary. Berina continued to deny that she intended to harm Mark. She claimed she believed the bottle contained water, not acid, and went as far as suggesting that Mark had planted the acid to deceive her into drinking it. Investigators found this hard to believe. In fact, during their investigation, they discovered that one of her internet searches led her to a source containing a strikingly similar scenario, nearly identical to the acid planting accusation she made against Mark. After being placed in a medically induced coma, Mark spent 4 months in intensive care as doctors at Southmead Hospital fought to stabilize him. When he finally awoke, the full extent of his injuries became devastatingly clear. As a result of neuropathy, he suffered from the loss of use of his muscles. Mark was paralyzed from the neck down, unable to move anything except his tongue. The acid had burned so deeply into his lower left leg that amputation was the only option to prevent further complications. Despite their efforts to save as much of the limb as possible, the damage was too extensive, and his leg had to be removed below the knee. The acid had eaten away his facial features, leaving him partially blind and with severe disfigurement. The moment Mark saw his reflection for the first time, he was devastated. He sadly exclaimed, "Kill me now. If this is what I look like, I don't want to live." Despite the support of his father and medical staff, Mark understandably struggled emotionally. He communicated using an alphabet board, painstakingly pointing to letters with his tongue. It was a slow, exhausting process, but it was the only way he could express himself. The overwhelming loss of independence combined with the constant physical pain plunged him into a deep depression. His father, Keys, stayed by his side, trying to lift his spirits, but Mark's emotional health deteriorated rapidly. The police documented the case meticulously, but Mark's injuries were so severe that officers decided never to release photos, not even to the media. In November 2016, Mark was transferred to a care home in Gloucester, but the conditions there were deplorable. Keys drove 800 miles to visit his son, only to find him covered in his own feces, crying out for help. The sight was heartbreaking, and Keys vowed to get him out. With the help of friends, the family arranged for a private ambulance to transfer Mark to Belgium, where they hoped he would receive better care. Even in Belgium, however, Mark's suffering continued. The acid had burned through membranes and bone, leaving holes in his body that caused constant, excruciating pain. The medical staff in Belgium did their best, but the hospital lacked a ward specifically equipped to care for someone with injuries as severe as Mark's. Every nerve in Mark's body seemed to be on fire, and the holes in his bones caused relentless pain. Mark grew increasingly despondent, so despite the progress he was actually making, like finally being able to speak again, he asked his father, "What's the point if all I can do is look at the ceiling?" Then, as if his suffering wasn't enough, Mark's condition worsened when he developed a severe lung infection. Treating the infection would require a tracheotomy, or 2 inserted into his throat. The procedure would save his life, but it would also take away his ability to speak, a small but vital comfort that had allowed him to maintain some connection with his father. For Mark, this was the final blow. Facing a life of paralysis, unrelenting pain, and now silence, Mark told his father that he could not go on any longer. With his family's support, Mark applied for voluntary euthanasia, which is legal in Belgium under certain conditions. His application was reviewed by 3 medical specialists, all of whom confirmed that Mark's was a case of unbearable suffering, both physical and psychological. They approved his request. So, on January 2nd, 2017, Mark spent his final moments with his father, whom he had asked to stay by his side until the very end. At 7:15 p.m., doctors inserted a catheter into Mark's heart, ending his life and suffering at the age of 29. Berina Wallace's trial began in April 2018, nearly 3 years after the attack. She pleaded not guilty to murder and manslaughter, insisting that she believed she was throwing water, not acid. However, her version of events quickly fell apart under scrutiny. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence that the attack was both malicious and premeditated. They detailed Berina's purchase of concentrated sulfuric acid, her deliberate removal of the label, and the extensive online searches she conducted on acid attacks. They argued that Berina's intent was not just to harm, but to permanently disfigure Mark, ensuring that no other woman would ever want him again. Witnesses testified to Berina's controlling and abusive behavior, painting a picture of a toxic relationship fueled by jealousy and manipulation. Mark's death, which occurred months after the attack, complicated the charges. Although Mark initially survived the attack, his catastrophic injuries were what led him to seek euthanasia. The prosecution contended that Berina's actions directly caused Mark's death, so a charge of murder was brought before the jury. But with euthanasia being involved, the jury had to consider whether her actions were the sole cause of his death, or whether there were any other contributing factors. Berina's defense attorneys argued that since Mark voluntarily ended his life, Berina could not be held fully accountable for his death. In the end, the jury was not convinced that Berina's actions met the legal threshold for murder or manslaughter. So the jury found Berina not guilty of both murder and manslaughter, leaving many people stunned. They did, however, find her guilty of throwing a corrosive substance with intent, a serious charge that carried a significant sentence. For the sentencing, the judge delivered a powerful statement that perfectly reflected both Berina's ruthlessness as well as the extreme devastation she inflicted. The judge stated, in part, on the 2nd of September, 2015, you bought a liter of 98% concentrated sulfuric acid. If necessary, your intention was to use the acid to attack Mark Van Dongen, because you wanted to and had left you for another woman. You removed the label from the bottle containing the colorless fluid, which stated that the acid causes severe burns and eye damage. You did so to prevent detection of the acid in your home. You chose your moment for the attack. It occurred when Mark Van Dongen, wearing only boxer shorts, was asleep in the bed which you had shared in your flat. Vulnerable, almost naked, he awoke but had no real opportunity to avoid the focus of your acid attack, namely his face and then his body. The burns which Mark sustained covered 2/3 of his face and a large percentage of his upper chest, arms, and upper thighs. The burns were almost all full thickness, affecting 25% of his total body space. As a result of skin graft procedures, over 40% of Mark's total body area was affected by the burns. A consultant in burn surgery said there had been no equivalent patient with similar extensive injuries following a chemical attack. Mark spent a total period of 11 months in the intensive care unit. He underwent a number of operative procedures. His left leg had to be amputated. He lost the sight in his left eye and damage was caused to the sight in his right eye. The doctors had to use the strongest pain relief, which in themselves caused difficult side effects. For 4 months, Mark was not really able to communicate. He sustained not only burns but injury to the systems of his body. When in ICU, he suffered recurrent chest infections, septicemic shock, his kidneys were injured, there were problems with his gut, and bleeding from a bowel. His heartbeat and liver function were altered. At the time of his discharge from the hospital in November 2016, he was paralyzed from the neck down with no movement in his upper arms and legs. Had Mark survived, there would have been further operations. He would have required extensive care for the rest of his life. Another treating clinician said that his physical appearance would never be restored to anything which could be described as normal. He had been permanently and irrevocably drastically disfigured. The facial scarring was categorized as the severe end of very severe scarring. Berina Wallace was sentenced to a minimum of 12 years in prison. Berina Wallace's conviction and sentence sparked mixed reactions. While her conviction offered some sense of justice, many, including Mark's family, felt the sentence was insufficient given the extent of his suffering. The case also reignited public debate over the use of acid as a weapon, prompting discussions about stricter regulations and harsher penalties for acid attacks. This heightened attention contributed to the enactment of the 2019 Offensive Weapons Act. That's the end of Case 3. Let's move on to the next case. Case 4. Stephen Beard, a retired television executive, was startled awake on October 2nd, 1999, to find his innards lying where his belly should have been. Conscious but bewildered, he reached for a phone on his nightstand and dialed 911 for Austin, Texas. "I need an ambulance," said Beard, 75. "My guts just jumped out of my stomach." They blew out, Yeah, they blew out of my stomach. They're lying on my stomach. Okay, said the 911 operator. They're laying on your stomach? I'm in awful pain, Beard said. How did this happen? It just happened. I just woke up. After another brief exchange, the operator said, I'm having a hard time figuring out what happened. So was Beard. I don't know what happened, he said. I've never had this happen before. As sheriff's deputies and an ambulance rushed toward the house, Beard had the presence of mind to ask the operator to phone his young wife, Celeste, who was sleeping in another wing of the 5,300 square foot mini-mansion in pricey Toro Canyon, west of Austin. But the jangling phone did not rouse the woman. The house was locked tight when help arrived. Rescuers peered through windows until they spotted Beard bleeding in bed. They broke a patio door to get inside. EMS personnel sized up the wound and surmised an incision from a hernia operation had failed. But as they hoisted the 300-pound man onto a stretcher, Travis County Deputy Sheriff Russell Thompson found something on the bedroom floor that explained Beard's intestinal blowout. It was a freshly fired shell casing from a 20-gauge shotgun. Beard was flown by medical helicopter to Brackenridge Hospital in Austin. His wife and her twin teenage daughters, whom Beard had recently adopted, followed him to the hospital in a police car. The girls were joined there by their boyfriends, and the five began a waiting room vigil. Paul Knight, a sheriff's investigator, was sent to the hospital to question them. He posed the query that every homicide investigator must ask the loved ones of a victim of an unsolved violent crime. Any idea who would have done this? Christopher Deuce, the boyfriend of one of the twins, spoke up. How about that crazy Tracy? That crazy Tracy, as the teenager put it, was Tracy Nolene Tarleton. In the 7 months before her husband was shot, Celeste Beard had become very friendly with Tarleton, manager of a bookstore. Tarleton, a heavy-set and plain 35-year-old, had led a rather troubled life with bouts of narcotics and alcohol abuse, and attempted self-checkout and psychological problems. The daughter of a respected Fort Worth lawyer, she graduated from Texas A&M in 1986 with a degree in biology. She worked in several unfulfilling natural resources jobs with the government before hiring on in 1994 at Book People in downtown Austin. She found her place there, working 60-hour weeks at a place that attracted the most eclectic elements of a very eclectic city. Tarleton was a lesbian, and she felt comfortable sharing her sexuality with the circle of open-minded friends and colleagues she developed at Book People. She excelled in the job and was soon promoted to manager. She earned regional notice in the book world, appearing on C-SPAN to talk about books and turning up in the newspapers from time to time, with comments about a new release or book trends. But in February 1999, Tarleton suffered a very public, nervous breakdown at work, shrieking obscenely and threatening violence. With the encouragement of family and friends, she checked into St. David's Pavilion, an Austin mental health facility, to try to regain her balance. Celeste Beard, meanwhile, was having problems of her own. For one thing, she was spending her husband's money like a crazy person. He gave her a $10,000 a month allowance, but that wasn't nearly enough. Her 3 walk-in closets were lined with hundreds of pairs of shoes, each with a purse to match. She could have gone a year and a half without donning the same footwear. She once went on a $50,000 shopping jag. She would throw extravagant parties for her friends on a whim, and the couple spent nearly $100,000 on a month-long trip to China in 1998. Beard was wealthy, but he was no Donald Trump. He had an estimated net worth of $12 million. In just 4 years of marriage, Celeste had raced through well over $1 million. Beard and his wife often bickered over her spending, but the issue reached a crisis stage when Beard's accountant tallied up her 1998 holiday shopping and entertainment. She had blown nearly $300,000. When Beard vowed to take away her credit cards, Celeste threatened self-checkout. Beard paid to send her away to St. David's Pavilion. Considerable expense, it was true, but one that might save him money in the long run. It was at St. David's in March 1999 that Celeste Beard became acquainted with Tracy Tarleton. Tarleton was immediately smitten by the attractive, leggy Celeste. A few weeks later, she wrote her a love note. Celeste, you are so beautiful. I think about your long, silky body and your incredible long legs, and I just can't stand it. And then I think of your incredible face, and I want to stand outside your building and wail until I get arrested. We won't even talk about what happens when I think about your sweet, tough, sexy voice. Christopher Deuce was not alone in suggesting Tarleton's name to authorities. When news of the Beard shooting broke, any number of people stepped forward to identify her as a possible suspect. Just about everyone, investigators noted, except Celeste Beard. Detective Rick Wines paid Tarleton a visit at her apartment 2 days after the shooting. We asked if she owned a 20-gauge shotgun, and she said yes, she did, Wines told CBS's 48 Hours. Tarleton was an avid skeet shooter. Somewhat reluctantly, she agreed to hand over her shotgun for ballistic testing. The $1,000 Franchi, manufactured in Italy, was engraved with Tracy's name. It had been a gift from her father. A few days later, police had their results. The shotgun shell that we found at the scene came from the shotgun that we found in her house, Wines said. 2 and 2 to me has always been 4. On October 8th, 6 days after the shooting, Tarleton was arrested and charged with assault. Meanwhile, against long odds, Stephen Beard seemed to begin a gradual recovery. His assailant had taken poor aim in the darkened bedroom. His brain and heart were spared, although his digestive organs were decimated. His condition stabilized after a series of 7 surgeries, and the immediate threat to his life seemed to pass. He was eventually released from the hospital, although he was considered to be at continued risk of infection due to the nature of his wound. Shotgun wounds to the midsection can kill slowly. When the digestive tract is perforated, the leakage can prove deadly through any number of infections, including peritonitis or bacterial sepsis in the blood. Beard was treated with antibiotics to head off infection, and his recovery seemed to be on course when he was released from the hospital on January 21, 2000. He died 4 days later. By some accounts, Celeste Beard was a vigilant and loving wife in her husband's final months. Friends said she spent countless hours at Stephen's side, yet there is indisputable evidence that she managed to console herself with a favorite pastime, shopping. Beard's accountant would later reveal that Celeste spent $321,000 during October and November 1999, an additional $249,000 by December 10th, and another $100,000 in the 6 weeks ending March 31, 2000. Investigators reasoned that the circumstances of the shooting were too odd to be a coincidence. A woman who was in love with Celeste Beard had murdered her husband. Common sense would suggest that the widow Beard had played a role. But Tracy Tarleton was not snitching. Prosecutors dangled offers for plea bargains if she would talk, but she sat mute, marking time in jail month after month. A grand jury called to hear evidence in the case was kept active for more than a year after Beard died, because prosecutors hoped Tarleton would have a change of heart and implicate Celeste Beard. They finally gave up, and Tarleton was indicted for murder on February 16, 2001. And then came the unexpected. Tarleton had a revelation, but it had nothing to do with anything proffered by prosecutors. Sitting in jail and reading an Austin newspaper, she saw an item about her beloved Celeste. The widow Beard had gotten over her loss and had quietly wed Cole Johnson, a bartender and musician in a part-time bar band, in a lovely private ceremony amid the mountain splendor of Aspen, Colorado. Dumped for a man, Tarleton began to understand that she had been duped. The enraged woman asked to meet with prosecutors. She spoke the words they had been waiting more than 18 months to hear. "I did it for Celeste." Celeste's marriage to Cole Johnson was her 5th trip to the altar. One could pick nits over the wisdom of each of the blessed events. But without question, the last would prove to be the most unwise. Celeste was raised in Ventura County, California, one of 4 adopted children of Edwin and Nancy Johnson. It was not a childhood filled with Golden State sunshine. She told intimates that she was abused by her adoptive father from age 4 to 12. Her adoptive mother was psychologically unstable and was institutionalized several times. She blamed the abuse for problems later in life. Once, during a conversation that was recorded by her daughter Christina, she said, "Do you know what it feels like when you're 4 years old? You aren't even in kindergarten. Do you know what that does to you?" She said she was later abused by an older adoptive brother as well. Celeste attempted self-checkout during puberty. She got pregnant at age 17, married another teenager, Craig Bratcher, and gave birth to twin girls, Christina and Jennifer. It was a tempestuous brief marriage that included bouts of physical abuse and restraining orders. She was divorced in 1983, but Celeste proved to be the marrying kind. She soon wed Harold Wolf, an Air Force mechanic, but they divorced in 1991. According to Celeste, her divorce lawyer paid for her to have a boob job after the split up. Celeste then moved to Arizona, where, struggling to make ends meet, she got into trouble for burning a car she had reported stolen. She was convicted of insurance fraud and spent 3 months in jail. Husband number 3 was a Mexican-American named Jimmy Martinez. Celeste had a raunchy sense of humor, and it would later come to light that she had a nickname for Martinez's private parts, BMW, for Big Mexican Wiener. That marriage, too, went kaput, and Celeste found herself single again in a new city, Austin, Texas. As she entered her 30s, she was treading water, working as a waitress in 1993 at the Austin Country Club. Among the regular customers, there were Stephen and Elise Beard, both in their 60s with grown children. Elise was an avid golfer, while Stephen preferred the club's indoor activities, eating and drinking. Elise fell ill with cancer and went quickly, dying on October 13, 1993. Stephen did not do well alone. Within weeks of the funeral, he yearned for steady company, and he began pursuing companionship in the person of Celeste Johnson Bratcher Wolf Martinez. They had their first date less than 3 weeks after Elise's death. Beard, 68, treated Celeste, 30, to a lavish Italian meal at Mamma Mia's restaurant in Austin. They enjoyed a nightcap at the mini mansion, and Stephen allowed Celeste to drive herself home in his $50,000 Lexus sedan. This, Celeste must have said to herself, could work out quite nicely. A Lexus beats the hell out of a BMW. Beard courted Celeste with ardor and an open checkbook. For Christmas 1993, he gave Celeste a $16,000 diamond cocktail ring, a $3,000 wristwatch, and a new Ford Explorer. In the first year of the relationship, Beard paid a $20,000 restitution bill hanging over Celeste's head from the insurance fraud in Arizona, and he funded a custody battle over the twin girls with Celeste's first husband. After 13 months of shacking up, Stephen agreed to make the relationship legitimate. But first, on February 8, 1995, he and Celeste signed a prenuptial agreement. She would get $500,000 and not a penny more if they divorced. If she became his widow, she would stand to get much more based upon a written will. He was generous, but he was no fool. Perhaps that is because nobody ever gave Stephen Beard a dime. The Texas native was a true bootstrapper. He served in the Navy Air Corps and attended college at Texas Christian and Southern Methodist. He worked in radio and advertising in Dallas in the 1950s and 60s, starting at the bottom and climbing steadily up the business ladder. He switched to television in the 70s, and by 1981, he had found financial success as partner and general manager of KBVO in Austin. In 1985, the station became one of the original affiliates of the fledgling Fox network. It grew in value and stature over the following decade. And on October 3, 1994, a year after his wife's death, Beard sold his share of the station for a small fortune. On February 18, 1995, Celeste and Stephen were married at the Austin Country Club. Their honeymoon passion involved a penis-stiffening drug injection that was administered by Celeste. She found the needles and medication unromantic and kind of traumatizing, as she put it. She would later say that the couple had sexual intercourse just twice, on the day she moved in with him and on the day they were married. The first months of marriage did not work out to Beard's satisfaction, perhaps due to Celeste's reticence to wield the sex needle. Beard got so desperate that he filed for divorce just 4 months after the wedding. He withdrew the petition after the couple came up with what Celeste later called the oral sex solution. Sunday mornings at the Beard mini mansion were reserved just for that. "I gotta go make some money," she would tell her daughters and anyone else within earshot as she plodded darley toward her husband's den for his weekly sexual service. She made certain there were no distractions. Locked up, doors secured, phones disconnected because she wanted Stephen to reach his happy ending as quickly as possible, according to an account in Susie Spencer's book, The Fortune Hunter. She loathed having to stop and begin again once she got started. Once they worked out this sexual kink in the relationship, money became their primary source of conflict. The $500,000 of the prenuptial agreement was a contentious issue for Celeste. And one day, Beard decided to simply give her the money and get it over with. He may have reasoned she would spend less of his money if she had some of her own. He was wrong. The $500,000 was gone in 6 months. After that spending binge, Celeste became increasingly vocal about her distaste for her older, overweight husband. She began to refer to Beard as the fat bastard or the old fool, according to her daughters and friends. More than once, people heard her say with exasperation, "Why doesn't he just die already?" Celeste began spending more and more time at a weekend house Beard owned on the Pedernales River, 40 miles northwest of Austin. She also rekindled an old flame, ex-husband Jimmy Martinez. Her daughters would later reveal that Celeste often slipped out of the house when Stephen went to bed at 9:30. Sometimes, they said, she would hasten his bedtime by spiking his food or drinks with pulverized sleeping pills. After the old man conked out, she would steal away to meet Martinez or party with her favorite drinking buddy, beauty salon receptionist Donna Goodson. But Beard finally got wise. He confronted Celeste after New Year's in 1999 about her out-of-control spending and trysts with Martinez. He hinted at divorce. After 5 years of a champagne and diamonds lifestyle, Celeste could not fathom regressing to her old car-torching, plate-carrying self. Even her prenup nest egg had evaporated. She threatened self-checkout and was packed off to St. David's Pavilion for mental health treatment. Her daughters judged that she was play-acting to get what she wanted, as Christina put it. What she wanted was money unencumbered by marriage to Beard. At St. David's, she took a foolish first step toward getting her wish. Tracy Tarleton and Celeste Beard met at St. David's, then transferred together to Timbalon, a mental health facility in Dallas. The women were caught in a passionate love clutch at Timbalon, and the staff there tried to keep them separated. But buckets of ice water couldn't have kept them apart, apparently. Celeste was extremely flirtatious with me from the beginning, Tarleton told CBS, and I responded in kind. Eventually, she came into my room and kissed me. She wanted to have a sexual relationship with me. Tarleton said the two women first had sex on March 20th, 1999, and the physical relationship continued until October 1st that year, the day before she shot Beard. They were no more discreet about their affair outside the hospital than they were inside. A photo from a book people party shows Celeste sitting on Tarleton's lap. Other party-goers would later say they saw the women kissing passionately. Tracy wasn't secretive, Jeremy Ellis, who worked with Tarleton, told CBS. Everyone in the store knew she was dating someone named Celeste. She spoke about her like she was her girlfriend. They were sort of physical, close with each other, and I thought, well, good for Tracy. Tarleton sent Celeste love letters, and Celeste sent Tarleton a birthday card addressed to the one I love. They became regular customers at an Austin Red Roof Inn. Yet Celeste apparently had to labor at Sapphic Love. In July, the women had a counseling session with Barbara Grant, an Austin psychotherapist, concerning their sexual relationship. Grant would later say that Celeste told her she doubted she was a lesbian because she needed alcohol to help work up the nerve to have sex with Tarleton. Celeste's daughters caught the women in bed at least twice, and they began seeing books about lesbian sex around the house. Pressed by her daughters to explain her behavior, Celeste said, "Tracy's a lesbian, and she's in love with me. Isn't that funny? My mother has acknowledged to me that she is involved in a romantic relationship with Tracy Tarleton, and that she and Tracy have had sexual relations together," Christina later stated in an affidavit. Tracy Tarleton has openly admitted to me that she and my mother are lovers. In September of 1999, I witnessed Tracy and my mother kissing passionately. So did Stephen Beard. After witnessing the women kiss on the lips on September 29th, he ran Tarleton out of his house. Another therapist, Susan Milholland, revealed that Tarleton had a romantic problem of her own. Milholland said Tarleton told her she had a self-destructive habit of falling passionately in love with married heterosexual women. Tarleton dreamed of marrying Celeste, and she viewed Stephen Beard as an obstacle to her happily ever after fantasy. As the relationship developed, Celeste complained bitterly to Tarleton that Beard was abusive. He belittled her, taunted her, and beat her down emotionally, according to Celeste. She added that she feared Beard would assault her if she threatened divorce. Tarleton could not imagine life without Celeste, and she vowed to do anything she could to save her from the professed cruelty of Beard. Together, the women began plotting to do away with Celeste's man problem, according to Tarleton. They came up with enough murder methods to flesh out the plots of a series of mystery novels. For example, they tried to concoct homemade botulism by allowing food to spoil and then fester. The women sprinkled the vile substance on a chili dog. Beard ate it and liked it. They spiked his drinks with 190 proof grain alcohol, then fastened a plastic bag around his head when he passed out. They dusted his food with sleeping pills and, on one occasion, 10 ecstasy tablets. He survived it all. The plotting became increasingly urgent in late September. Beard and his wife were scheduled to travel to Europe. Celeste dreaded the trip, and she convinced Tarleton, in her finest drama Queen Haidujuan, that her life hung in the balance. She came over and was just hysterical beside herself, Tarleton told CBS. She said, "I'll never survive this trip." I wanted to help her. The women came up with the shotgun solution. Tarleton told investigators that Celeste had set it all up. Beard was asleep, the doors were open, and Celeste was in another wing of the house. Tarleton slipped in, fired a single shot in the dark, and slipped out unnoticed. The scheme didn't have a prayer of working, of course, since half of Austin knew that the victim's wife had a lesbian lover who owned a shotgun. Tarleton and Celeste managed to maintain regular phone contact for the first 9 months Tarleton spent in jail. But their relationship became strained as Celeste grew increasingly overwrought. Finally, in the summer of 2000, Tarleton and Celeste called off their relationship. Celeste started going bananas, hysterical a lot of the time, Tarleton told CBS. "We both said, we're not going to do this anymore. You won't see me again." Tarleton was distraught and apparently took an overdose of Valium. Still, she refused to finger Celeste in the murder. That changed a few weeks after the breakup when she read a newspaper story about Celeste. It said she had married Cole Johnson on July 3, 2000, within a few days of their breakup. Tarleton reached the conclusion that she had been used. "She's off at her honeymoon in Aspen," she told CBS. "Even I couldn't overlook that. It was like everything started unraveling very quickly for me after that article. I started realizing Celeste had been lying to me all along, that this man was not abusing her, that she had married him for his money, and that she had been lying to me about our relationship. All of it was a farce." Tarleton sat down with prosecutors and detectives and told her story. Celeste was arrested on March 28, 2002, and charged with her former husband's murder. A judge set bail at $8 million, noting that Celeste had earned $2 million after selling the mini-mansion just months after Beard died. The woman's lawyer argued she had just $7,289 left 1 year and 4 months later. Celeste's problems deepened a few months later when she was indicted for another felony that was perhaps even more quixotic than the murder. Authorities alleged that she had tried to hire her friend Donna Goodson to murder Tracy Tarleton. Celeste's trial was like a nightmare variation on This Is Your Life. She couldn't stand Steve Beard, prosecutor Allison Weitzel told jurors. She talked to people about how she hated him. He disgusted her. What happened here is a simple case of a greedy, manipulative defendant who took advantage of a mentally ill woman who was in love with her. She told Tracy that with Steve gone, they could be together. Tarleton, appearing sullen, took the witness stand for a total of 15 hours over 3 days. She guided jurors through the affair and the murder scheme. She had pleaded guilty and agreed to testify in exchange for a 20-year sentence. "I just saw this woman that I loved in a desperate situation, trying to find a way to survive this man that was so awful," Tarleton said. "She had a plan. She wanted me to shoot him at Toro Canyon with my shotgun. I was willing to shoot him, and I went and did it." She added that she and Stephen Beard had been betrayed by the same woman. Relatives, friends, shrinks, and Tarleton's colleagues from work all testified that they believed the women had a sexual relationship. Prosecutors added photographs, love notes, cards, and Tarleton's journal as further documentary proof. Yet Dick DeGuerin, Celeste's prominent and expensive criminal defense attorney, dismissed this mountain of evidence as part of a fantasy of a predatory, aggressive lesbian. The defense strategy boiled down to 3 words: Tracy is crazy. "This is a case of fatal attraction," said DeGuerin. "Tracy Tarleton is psychotic. She's been diagnosed as having delusions, as hearing voices that aren't there, as seeing things that aren't there." During a pre-trial deposition, Celeste had flatly denied so much as kissing Tarleton. The statement was read to jurors, who surely puzzled over the denial in the face of contradictory testimony from a dozen eyewitnesses. These included Celeste's twin daughters, who added devastating corroborating testimony. Over 3 days on the witness stand, the young women said it was a mercenary marriage for their mother. She said that she married Steve for his money, testified Jennifer. Christina added, she would sometimes make comments like, "Why doesn't he just die already?" She would say that he disgusted her. No detail was spared, including the Sabbath sexual get-togethers. "What was the Sunday suck?" asked prosecutor Weitzel. "Celeste giving Steve a sloppy toppy," replied Jennifer. The daughter said Celeste would rant about the Sunday suck, then run off to see Tarleton or Jimmy Martinez. Jurors heard Celeste's raunchy mouth firsthand during a mommy dearest moment on a recording daughter Christina made of one of their conversations. When the girl accused her mother of threatening self-checkout in February 1999, Celeste screamed, "I was depressed, you goddamn little bitch." Bankers and accountants offered itemized details on Celeste's extravagant spending. They also detailed the prenuptial agreement and testified that Celeste stood to gain roughly $6 million, half of Beard's estate as a result of his death. At the end of the testimony, Prosecutor Weitzel summed up by saying, "Money is what this whole case is about." Jurors deliberated 23 hours over 3 days before voting to convict. Prosecutors did not seek the death penalty, and the conviction brought a mandatory life sentence. But Stephen Beard's loved ones were given the opportunity to address Celeste during a sentencing hearing. "I hope you burn in hell," said Beard's namesake son, Stephen Beard III. Perhaps most punishing were the comments of Celeste's daughter, Christina. "You say we turned on you," Christina said. "Well, you turned on us. You turned on the whole Beard family. He let you into his home, loved you, honored, obeyed you, and you violated him and murdered him. Shame on you." By Texas law, Celeste must serve at least 40 years in prison. She won't be eligible for parole until age 80. Trigger woman Tarleton received a 10-year reduced sentence in exchange for testifying against Celeste, and was released on parole in August 2011 and lives in San Antonio. Celeste was denied the inheritance she expected to receive. Beard's estate went to his blood children, as well as to Christina and Jennifer, his adopted daughters. In TV interviews, Celeste continued to deny any involvement. She said she was a victim of her daughters, whom she accused in a neat twist of being motivated by money. "I hate to admit it, but the only reason why they could have turned on me was for the money," she told CBS. "They have 2 million reasons to lie." Celeste did receive more than $1 million from the sale of property, for which she was legally the co-owner. She paid much of it to DeGuerin, but was left with a 6-figure sum. Until 2043, her shopping sprees will be limited to prison commissaries. Case 5. In 1983, there was a young woman named Parvez who lived in Punjab. She was widely admired for her outstanding academic skills and her impressive command of English. From a very young age, Parvez dreamed of becoming a teacher. Teaching wasn't just her career goal, it was her passion, a dream she held on to tightly during her college years. But life didn't go as Parvez had hoped. Her father had different plans for her future. Instead of supporting her dream, he arranged her marriage to a man from a Sikh family who lived in Canada. The man seemed well settled, and her father thought this match would secure a good future for her. However, Parvez was heartbroken by this decision. Becoming a teacher was her only desire, and marriage wasn't a priority for her. Parvez couldn't go against her father's wishes and reluctantly agreed to the marriage. Leaving everything behind, she moved to Canada with her husband. At first, life seemed hopeful as he treated her well, and she adjusted to her new surroundings. However, his true colors soon emerged. He began pressuring her to work, prioritizing her income over their happiness. Parvez started working on a mushroom farm, far from the life she had imagined. On July 20th, 1985, she gave birth to a daughter, Harjeet, hoping this would bring peace. But even 6 months later, her husband demanded she return to work, forcing her to take a factory job. In the midst of this hardship, Parvez became pregnant again. Despite her fragile health and the ongoing challenges, she continued working in the factory. Later, in 1988, she gave birth to another daughter. Life continued its exhausting cycle for Parvez, with little support or compassion from her husband. Tensions were running high in Parvez's home, as she and her husband often found themselves in heated arguments. One day, things took a dark turn when her husband lost control and physically assaulted her. This shocking incident pushed Parvez to take a stand. She courageously went to the police and filed a complaint, determined to seek justice for the endured. Her actions led to serious consequences for her husband, who was sent to jail for a week because of the domestic violence complaint. After his release, it seemed like her husband had a change of heart. He began treating Parvez with care and kindness, trying to mend their broken relationship. Life started to feel calmer, but this peace didn't last long. Out of nowhere, Parvez's health took a sudden and drastic turn for the worse. She began experiencing intense pain all over her body, pain that doctors couldn't explain. Alongside this, she was plagued by severe headaches that left her feeling helpless. Desperate to find relief, Parvez started taking a lot of painkillers, hoping they would ease her suffering. As days turned into nights, Parvez's pain became unbearable. She would scream out suddenly, her cries echoing through the neighborhood. One fateful day, Parvez experienced an unimaginable electric shock-like sensation that shot through her teeth, spine, arms, and legs. Her body twisted uncontrollably, bending in unnatural ways, almost like a bow being drawn. The horrifying scene sent chills down the spine of her second daughter, who watched in terror as her mother writhed in pain. Overcome with fear and desperation, her daughter ran out, calling for help from the neighbors. A group of them rushed in to find Parvez in a grotesquely contorted state, writhing on the floor. The sight was chilling, leaving everyone frozen with horror and helplessness. When news of her condition reached her husband, it shattered him. Seeing Parvez in such unbearable pain and despair moved him in a way nothing else had. For the first time, he appeared genuinely broken. In a desperate attempt to help, Parvez's husband rushed to the kitchen, frantically bringing her a glass of water, while the neighbors tried their best to steady her convulsing body. Without wasting another moment, they decided to take her to the nearest hospital. At the hospital, a team of doctors gathered to assess Parvez's alarming condition. However, they were left puzzled. Her symptoms were baffling, and no tests or examinations could reveal the cause of her excruciating pain and convulsions. As her condition deteriorated further, the doctors made the grave decision to place her on life support, in an attempt to keep her alive, while they explored every possible treatment option. Despite their best efforts, the medical team reached a heartbreaking conclusion. They could do no more. On February 3rd, just 3 days after being admitted to the hospital, Parvez's battle came to a tragic end. She passed away, leaving behind a void filled with unanswered questions, grief, and lingering remorse. Parvez's sudden and tragic death left both her family and her husband's relatives drowning in grief and confusion. They struggled to understand how her health could take such a devastating turn. When asked, her husband shared a troubling detail. Parvez had been suffering from severe headaches and was taking medication prescribed by a doctor. He feared these medications might have triggered the mysterious symptoms that ultimately claimed her life. What really happened to Parvez? Were her symptoms a tragic reaction to the medication, or was there something far more sinister behind her death? Let's go back to Parvez's story, or more specifically, what happened a year and a half after her death. On June 23, 1988, in the quiet town of Hamilton, Ranjit Singh lived a happy life with his wife, Lakhwinder Kaur. It was a normal evening like any other. Lakhwinder was in the kitchen, washing dishes after finishing the dinner work. Ranjit was sitting in the living room, relaxing on the sofa and watching TV. Suddenly, a loud and terrifying scream broke the silence of their home. Startled, Lakhwinder ran to the living room, her heart pounding with fear. What she saw made her freeze in shock. Ranjit's body was bent in strange ways, his face twisted in pain, his arms and legs were moving wildly, as if he was fighting something no one could see. His cries of pain filled the house, making Lakhwinder's fear grow even stronger. She stood there, not knowing what to do or how to help. What could have caused such a horrifying episode? Could there be a link to Parvez's strange and tragic death, or was this something entirely different? Stay with us as we uncover the shocking details that connect these events, unraveling a case that left an entire nation in disbelief. As Lakhwinder struggled to lift her husband, Ranjit, she realized his weight was too much for her to manage. Overwhelmed with panic, she quickly called emergency services. Within minutes, an ambulance arrived, and Ranjit was rushed to the hospital. Doctors worked quickly, conducting a series of tests, but the results left them puzzled. Ranjit's body showed no visible injuries or signs of any serious illness. With no clear answers, they speculated that he might have suffered a heart attack, though they couldn't confirm it with certainty. Distraught and unsure of what had truly happened, she informed Ranjit's family and close friends, including his business partner, Sukhwinder Singh. Sukhwinder was deeply shaken by the news. He had placed immense trust in Ranjit, not just as a partner, but also as a close confidant. The shock of Ranjit's sudden passing left him heartbroken and worried about the future of their shared business, which now hung in uncertainty. The questions surrounding Ranjit's death only added to the growing unease, leaving everyone grasping for answers. After Ranjit's funeral was over and the family had said their goodbyes, life began to move forward, though slowly and painfully. Sukhwinder Singh, Ranjit's trusted business partner, stepped in to take charge of managing their business. But as he took on this responsibility, a surprising twist in their professional relationship came to light. Ranjit and Sukhwinder had earlier taken out a joint life insurance policy worth $2 lakh. This policy had a very unusual condition. If one of them passed away, the insurance money would go directly to the surviving partner. They had made this arrangement to ensure that their business wouldn't suffer financially if either of them died in an accident. After Ranjit's sudden death, the insurance payout was meant to go to Sukhwinder Singh, as he was the surviving partner. However, there was a process that had to be followed before the money could be handed over. The insurance company required a full investigation into Ranjit's death to ensure there was no suspicious cause or foul play involved. An officer from the insurance company was assigned to the case. This officer's job was to examine every detail surrounding Ranjit's death and prepare a thorough report. Only after the report was submitted and approved would the insurance company release the $2 lakh payout to Singh. And now, the story takes a shocking turn. Cliff Elliott, the life insurance company's claim investigator, arrived at Singh's house in Hamilton to verify the details of the insurance claim. As part of his routine, he carefully reviewed all the insurance documents. Everything appeared to be in order. No irregularities, no missing signatures, no errors. It seemed like a straightforward case. But as Elliot sat in Suckwinder's living room, something unusual caught his eye. On the wall hung a picture of Guru Nanak, framed beautifully and placed with care. At first glance, it seemed like an ordinary photograph, common in many Sikh households. But something about it struck Elliot as oddly familiar. His mind raced back to another case he had handled more than a year ago. It was the mysterious death of a woman named Parvez, who had passed away under strange circumstances. While investigating that claim, Elliot had noticed a photo of Guru Nanak, the same size, the same frame, and the same color, hanging in her house. Yes, you guessed it right. Parvez's husband was none other than Singh. The same man who had claimed the insurance money after his wife's mysterious death was now at the center of another similar case. Cliff Elliott sat frozen for a moment, the weight of this revelation sinking in. 2 deaths, 2 massive insurance claims, and one man at the heart of both. This couldn't be a coincidence. Elliot found the situation deeply suspicious. Convinced that something sinister might be at play, Elliot reached out to the Hamilton police and shared his findings. He explained how, within just 1.5 years, Singh had lost 2 people very close to him, his wife Parvez and his business partner Ranjit, both under mysterious circumstances. In both instances, Suckwinder had received a large sum of insurance money, raising serious doubts about his possible involvement. The Hamilton police were immediately intrigued. The situation struck them as highly unusual, and they agreed that it warranted further investigation. And what they found next was something no one could have imagined. While looking into the deaths of Parvez and Ranjit, the detectives discovered that there were 3 more mysterious deaths connected. But before we continue, I just want to remind you all 95% of you watch our videos without subscribing. If you enjoy these mysteries, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any updates. Thank you for your support. Now back to the story. The Hamilton police decided to appoint 2 detectives to look into this case. They started fresh, carefully going through everything again. As they investigated, they found something strange. Singh had been traveling to India a lot over the years. He often went there around the time of the mysterious deaths. This made the detectives even more suspicious. To get to the bottom of it, the detectives contacted the Punjab police in India. They worked together to plan a visit to India to dig deeper into Suckwinder's past and activities. When the Indian police were contacted, it was revealed that just 9 weeks after his wife's death, Suckwinder married another woman named Sarveet from a village called Panchgrain near Jalandhar. After this marriage, he told people he was returning to Canada, but never went. Instead, he married another woman, Kushwinder Sam from Kapurthala. His main goal behind these marriages was to collect large dowries. Suckwinder continued traveling between India and Canada, taking advantage of women and their families for money. Shockingly, he didn't stop with 2 marriages. In every case, he promised the brides a luxurious life in Canada and demanded huge dowries, focusing more on money than anything else. During the police investigation, disturbing details emerged about Suckwinder Singh Dhillon's second wife, Sarveet. She had given birth to twin boys, Gurmeet and Gurvinder. Tragically, both babies passed away just 12 days after their birth. When asked about the cause, Sarveet revealed that the twins suddenly showed unusual symptoms and their condition worsened for no apparent reason. This strange tragedy was eerily similar to the mysterious deaths of Suckwinder's first wife and his business partner, Rajni Ranjit. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered even darker secrets. Suckwinder's third wife, Kushwinder Singh, had also died under suspicious circumstances. Neighbors reported that before her death, Kushwinder's body showed odd signs of distress, including strange movements and unexplained reactions. Despite the suspicious nature of her passing, the family skipped a post-mortem and performed her last rites, according to customs. The investigation revealed a chilling pattern. Suckwinder's third wife had reportedly been in good health with no prior issues, yet she too met a sudden and mysterious end. With 5 deaths occurring within just 17 months, the case raised alarming questions about Suckwinder's involvement. The investigation took a sinister turn when the burial site of the twin boys was excavated, and their remains were sent to the Toronto Forensic Science Centre for analysis. At the same time, forensic reports from the earlier deaths of Suckwinder's first wife and his business partner in Canada were reviewed. The findings exposed a horrifying truth. All the victims had been poisoned using the same lethal substance. Tracing the source of the poison, investigators identified a specific tree whose seed Suckwinder used to create a deadly mixture. He converted these seeds into pills, which he disguised as health supplements or strength boosters. Under this facade, he deceived his victims, giving the pills to his business partner as a remedy for physical weakness and to his wife as a treatment for her illness. This revelation painted a dark picture of Suckwinder's calculated and cold-blooded actions, leaving investigators determined to bring justice for his victims. The most chilling revelation came when investigators discovered that Suckwinder had instructed his second wife to give the pills to their twin sons. He convinced her that the pills would strengthen the babies and improve their health. Despite overwhelming evidence, justice seemed out of reach. In India, no formal complaint or first information report (FIR) was filed regarding the deaths of the twins or his second wife, and no trial was conducted. Similarly, Canadian authorities did not pursue legal action for the deaths of Suckwinder's first wife and his business partner, even though forensic findings clearly linked him to their murders through poisoning. Suckwinder's actions revealed the calculated mind of a cold-blooded murderer who exploited the trust of those around him to commit his heinous crimes. Yet, for years, he managed to escape accountability in both countries. In 1997, the law finally caught up with him when he was arrested at his workshop. During intense interrogation, he broke down and confessed to his crimes. After a lengthy trial, Suckwinder Singh Dillon was sentenced to life imprisonment on August 1, 2001, with a minimum term of 25 years. His life in prison reflected the misery he had inflicted on others. On November 16, 2013, Suckwinder passed away in a hospital. While some reports claimed he died of cancer, others suggested a sudden illness. Regardless of the cause, his life ended in the same darkness that defined his crimes. The case attracted widespread media attention in both India and Canada. Investigative reports, forensic findings, and courtroom drama were widely covered, inspiring a best-selling book that won several awards for its gripping narrative. In 2003, a film based on the case was released, followed by various adaptations, solidifying it as one of the most infamous crime stories of the era. Suckwinder confessed that his were driven by greed. He admitted to killing for financial gain, including life insurance claims ranging from $100,000 to $200,000. His indifference toward human life was evident in his chilling remark about his twin sons' deaths. He claimed he didn't want the burden of raising children to complicate his pursuit of wealth. Money was his sole obsession, and he stopped at nothing to achieve it. And that's today's story. Case 6. Sharon Pryor was born in the winter of 1959 in the picturesque city of Montreal. Her mother, who was born in Great Britain, had immigrated to Canada with her family at a young age and spent her entire life there. It was in Canada that fate brought her together with her future husband, George, who served in the Canadian Army. The young couple fell in love at first sight and soon got married. Shortly after, their firstborn child, Sharon, came into the world. Just a couple of days before the little girl's second birthday, her mother gave birth to 2 more children twins named Doreen and Maureen. In 1962, George was transferred to the city of Manitoba for military service, where he moved with his family. Their new home was located in one of the city's older neighborhoods, which was nevertheless considered quite safe and peaceful. Sometime after the move, the couple welcomed another child, a son they named George Jr. Unfortunately, soon after this, problems began to arise in the family, and the tension in the relationship reached a critical point. As a result, in 1965, the couple decided to divorce. George continued his military service and was often away, while his ex-wife and 4 children moved into an apartment in the city of Langley, which they were provided through a special assistance program for military families. It was a quiet and cozy place, ideal for raising children. The woman had no idea that even in such peaceful neighborhoods, true monsters in human form could be lurking. From childhood, Sharon was an incredibly kind, caring, and compassionate girl. She was always ready to help those in need, whether it was a person or a defenseless animal. The girl often picked up stray cats and dogs off the streets, especially those that had suffered from human cruelty or illness. She lovingly cared for them, nursed them back to health, and only then sought new owners for them. Sharon adored animals and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian in the future. In addition, the girl was passionate about sports and creativity. She attended a hockey club, art classes, and even took needlework lessons. It seemed that a wonderful future full of bright events and accomplishments awaited her. Her mother couldn't be more proud of her eldest daughter, who was growing up to be independent, responsible, and sensible beyond her years. Sharon always tried to avoid bad company and trouble. But unfortunately, even this did not save her from a fatal encounter with true evil. In 1975, life was going on as usual for the Pryor family. 16-year-old Sharon, like all teenagers, was facing typical problems and difficulties for her age. She loved trendy music and stylish clothes, which her parents did not always approve of. In addition, the girl had started dating a boy named John, who had been in love with her since the 4th grade. He had finally managed to win Sharon's heart, and the young couple began seeing each other. They often hung out with friends, and seemed like the perfect match. Seeing their sincere feelings, the girl's parents supported the relationship. According to Sharon's mother, she and her daughter never had any serious arguments. There was always mutual understanding and respect between them. The girl was surrounded by only good people, but even they could not protect her from the terrible tragedy that shattered the life of the entire family. March 29, 1975, began like any ordinary day. Sharon woke up and had breakfast while her mother was out shopping for Easter groceries and gifts. Upon returning home, the woman brought the purchases inside, and her eldest daughter helped put them away. This day was supposed to be special for the whole family. The mother's friends were planning to visit with their son Stephen, as well as her boyfriend. Sharon spent most of the day painting Easter eggs and preparing for the holiday. Stephen arrived before the other guests and played with the girl's younger brother. After school, Sharon and Stephen were going to stop by the local sports association, which in addition to sports, also did needlework. The girl was supposed to pick up a special jacket there, which was called Leo, named after one of the organization's founders who had died of leukemia. This jacket was a symbol of membership in the association, but it was not simply handed out. To earn such a reward, children had to prove themselves. For example, by selling lottery tickets. Sharon really wanted to deserve this jacket and managed to sell enough tickets. Therefore, she eagerly and proudly went to the association to collect her prize. But disappointment awaited the girl. There was no jacket in her size available. Saddened, Sharon had to return home empty-handed with Stephen. However, she did not lose her festive mood and decided to pick up the jacket another time. Upon returning, the girl joined her mother and her boyfriend Doug, helping them with the final preparations. When all the guests had gathered, a wonderful holiday dinner took place. Afterward, Sharon and her mom hid painted eggs around the house for the younger children to have fun searching for later. Then the girl asked her mother for permission to go to the local Marina pizzeria, which was a popular hangout spot for teenagers and was located not far from their home. The woman had already allowed her daughter to go there with friends many times before, so this time was no exception. Sharon went to her room to get ready. Around 6 o'clock in the evening, a neighborhood girl stopped by the Pryor's house. She sat with Sharon and chatted while the latter was getting dressed to go out. Our story's heroine borrowed one of her mom's sweaters and put on her favorite suede jacket. At 6:30, the girls left the house. But Sharon went to the pizzeria alone. The neighbor changed her mind about accompanying her. The girls said goodbye and each went their separate way, one home and the other to meet up with friends. A whole group of young people had already gathered at Marina, waiting for Sharon. But for some reason, she did not show up at the appointed time. The teenagers figured the girl had simply decided to take a little walk with her boyfriend John, so they continued their merry feast, unaware that something bad had happened. At this time, John and a few friends were at home watching a hockey match. When the game ended, the boys also headed to the pizzeria, hoping to find Sharon there. But she never came. John was extremely surprised because he hadn't seen his girlfriend since school and had no idea where she could be. Like the others, he thought that after the match, he would definitely find Sharon at Marina. Her absence alarmed everyone present, as it was completely out of character for the always punctual and responsible girl. While Sharon was away from home, Her mother put the younger children to bed and spent the evening in front of the TV. The woman began to worry that her daughter had still not returned, even though she should have been home a long time ago. However, she decided not to panic prematurely, assuming the girl had simply lost track of time in the company of friends or with her boyfriend. The mother remained waiting in the living room, so as not to miss the moment when Sharon would finally come home. But the hours passed, and the girl was still nowhere to be seen. Around midnight, the woman could no longer contain her fear, as there was still no word from her daughter. It was awkward to call her friends at such a late hour, so the mother had to wait until morning, periodically glancing out the window in the hope of seeing Sharon. At the first light of dawn, the alarmed woman began calling her daughter's acquaintances, hoping to find out where she might be. But neither her girlfriends nor boyfriend John had any idea about the girl's whereabouts. The mother's worst suspicions were confirmed that evening. Sharon had not made it to the pizzeria. The neighbor girl with whom they had left the house together confirmed that she had parted ways with Sharon on the street and had not seen her since. A conversation with Mary, Sharon's closest friend, further heightened the anxiety. From her, the mother learned that, after 7 o'clock in the evening, an attack had occurred near the pizzeria on a 23-year-old woman named Cheryl Roy. An unknown man had lunged at her with a knife, but luckily, there were people passing by at that moment. Hearing the victim's screams, they scared off the attacker, and he fled in the direction from which Sharon was supposed to come. According to witnesses, it was a tall, dark-haired man with blue eyes and a mustache. He spoke in a quiet, calm voice and was wearing a ski jacket, blue jeans, and pointed-toe shoes. Hearing these details, Sharon's mother was seized by panic. She realized that the place and time of the attack exactly coincided with the route her daughter usually took. The woman immediately went to the police, but the detectives were in no hurry to jump to premature conclusions. Instead of immediately accusing someone of the crime, they decided to launch a large-scale search operation without delay. Hundreds of concerned citizens who learned about the girl's disappearance joined the search. They were given a photo and description of the 16-year-old schoolgirl and combed every corner in the hope of finding her. The mother appeared on local television to tell the community about what had happened. She begged anyone with any information to report it to the police and help find her daughter. Unfortunately, the search yielded no results. Several days passed, but no leads on Sharon's whereabouts emerged. The mother continued to believe that the girl would return home safe and sound. The police tried to maintain hope in her, although they themselves understood that after the critical 48 hours, the chances of finding the teenager alive were rapidly dwindling. Sharon had no reason to run away from home, no conflicts with her parents or problems at school. Her boyfriend John was a decent young man, and their relationship was filled with love and understanding. He definitely could not have hurt the girl, and in general, Sharon did not have conflicts with anyone and stayed away from bad company. That is why, at the beginning of the investigation, the police had neither suspects nor leads. Attempts to locate the knife-wielding man seen in the area also proved fruitless. The tense silence dragged on, exhausting the missing girl's mother, who continued to hope for a miracle. On the morning of April 1st, around 6 o'clock, the woman woke up and looked out the window. What she saw seemed extremely suspicious to her. A young man came out of the house of Sharon's friend, crossed the street, and took the newspaper left on the doorstep of their home. Gripped by a bad premonition, the mother called out to him, trying to understand what made the guy get up so early and steal someone else's newspaper. But instead of answering, he only quickened his pace, hurrying to leave. The woman ran out into the street and caught up with the young man. He tried to hold onto the newspaper, but the distraught mother snatched it from his hands. The guy shouted, begging her not to look, but it was too late. On the front page was a photo of a girl's body found in the snow, just a few minutes' drive from their home in the suburbs. The woman was shocked not only by this terrible news, but also by the fact that police had not informed her, even though they should have. She learned the truth much later than her neighbors, who had read the morning papers. The mother tried to convince herself that the deceased was not Sharon, but simply some schoolgirl who resembled her. Finally composing herself, she called the police to dispel the chilling suspicion. The detectives replied that they were not yet certain of the victim's identity and invited the woman to come for identification. She was so horrified that she could not bring herself to do it, so she asked her ex-husband to go in her place. The entire neighborhood was in shock, as the girl in the photo did indeed bear a strong resemblance to the missing Sharon. Moreover, her clothing exactly matched the description the mother had given to the police. The father immediately recognized his daughter in the deceased, leaving no doubt. The 16-year-old schoolgirl was dead. Her body was discovered by a local resident who had learned about the girl's disappearance from the newspapers. When he saw the corpse, he immediately realized that he had found Sharon. The man promptly reported the terrible find and the fact that someone had trespassed on his property. He always kept all the doors locked, but on Tuesday, he noticed that the lock was broken, although there were no signs of a break-in, as if the perpetrator had used his own key, even though only the owner had free access to the house. Going out to the driveway, the man saw a woman's body, naked from the waist down. At the same time, nothing was missing from the house. Jack could not understand why someone had dumped the corpse on his property. The police arrived at the scene and began a murder investigation. Law enforcement officers immediately noted the brutality of the crime. There were numerous traces of beatings, bruises, and hemorrhages on the body. The victim was wearing only a suede jacket and a blue sweater, completely undressed below the waist. Her jeans were found a few meters from the body, and her underwear was hanging in a nearby tree. The mouth was taped with a heavily chewed tape tangled in her hair. The girl was posthumously clutching it in her hand, apparently. She had been trying with her last strength to free herself. Traces in the snow indicated that Sharon had tried to get up, meaning the killer had left her to die while she was still alive. The tortured schoolgirl simply did not have enough strength to save herself. Law enforcement officers also found other physical evidence at the crime scene. About 50 feet from the dead girl, tire tracks remained on the ground. A barely noticeable trail of blood droplets led from this point to the body. Since there were no signs of dragging, the detectives assumed that several people might have been involved in the murder. No dirt was found on Sharon herself, her socks, or her shoes, so she had not crawled on her own. Most likely, she was carried out of a car and left to die in the cold. Not far from the tortured schoolgirl lay a man's shirt. The victim's wrists bore traces of being tied up, apparently. She had been bound with this very garment. The find helped establish that the prime suspect in this brutal crime was quite tall. Near the gatepost, he left another important clue, a clear shoe print. A receipt for the Leo jacket, which the unfortunate girl never had a chance to receive, was also found there. The results of the forensic examination showed that Sharon's death had occurred just a few hours before the body was discovered. Obviously, she'd been held captive from Saturday to Tuesday, subjected to abuse and rape. There were characteristic marks of strangulation on her neck. The girl had choked on her own blood. Forensic experts also recorded that her ribs were literally crushed. It appeared as if the executioner had been kneeling on the victim's chest. In addition, the poor girl had suffered a severe head injury and internal bleeding. Her body was covered with numerous stab wounds, and her jaw was broken on both sides. The nose was also smashed, and the cheek was torn by her own knocked-out tooth. Hundreds of townspeople came to the local Presbyterian church to say goodbye to Sharon Pryor. Her mother could barely stand, paralyzed by grief. The only thing she could think about at that moment was for the murderer to be caught and punished as soon as possible. 3 blocks away from Sharon's brutal murder, Canada had already faced a similar crime against a minor. On July 9, 1974, in Stugai, 12-year-old Norma O'Brien was brutally killed. That evening, she had left home intending to play water polo at the pool. But upon arriving, the girl found that it was closed for repairs. Norma turned around and started walking home. She never made it there. That same evening, her parents raised the alarm, reporting their daughter missing. They categorically rejected the possibility of her running away, so the search began immediately. The next day, the schoolgirl's mutilated, half-naked body was found in a field near the pool. There were striking parallels between the murders of Norma and Sharon. Both girls were partially undressed, raped, brutally beaten, and strangled. Moreover, the attack sites were located within a half-hour drive of each other. This led to the idea that the crimes could have been committed by the same maniac. But the investigators had no leads. Already after the massacre of Sharon on June 23, 1975, another girl went missing in Stugai, 14-year-old Debbie Fisher. She was returning home on a red bicycle, but never arrived. The next day, her naked body was found in the woods. Unlike the previous victims, Debbie had not been raped. The cause of death was a blow to the head with a rock. Soon, a 17-year-old boy was arrested for this crime, and he confessed to the deed. Due to his status as a minor, his name and photo were not disclosed. The killer recounted that on that day, around 6:30 in the evening, he was riding home from work on his moped. Suddenly he spotted Debbie pedaling her bicycle with a bottle of milk in her hand. He scrutinized the girl closely, and a chilling plan took shape in his mind. After greeting her, to which she responded in kind, the guy overtook her and hid his moped in the bushes. Then he sat down on the curb and pretended to be crying. Debbie, seeing this, stopped. The young man asked her to come closer, which she did. At that very moment, the scoundrel grabbed the girl and began groping her. Snatching the bottle from her hands, he hurled it into the field, and then, with all his might, he struck Debbie on the head with a rock. The schoolgirl lost consciousness. Hiding her bicycle in the bushes, the pervert tried to rape the victim but failed. Enraged by the setback, he hit the girl with the rock once more. Debbie died from the injury sustained. The criminal hid the lifeless body in an abandoned car in the woods and fled on his moped. Later, Debbie Fisher's murderer also confessed to killing Norma O'Brien a year earlier. But he insisted that he had nothing to do with Sharon Pryor's death. At the time of her demise, the young man had a confirmed alibi, so he was not considered a suspect in this case. He was convicted only for the murders of the two other girls. However, given his minor status, the punishment was not too severe, a few years behind bars. Now, the former juvenile killer lives and works in Montreal. At the site where Sharon Pryor's body was discovered, the police collected a lot of evidence that should have led them to the murderer. The detectives hoped to solve this case within a matter of days, but reality proved far from their expectations. 13 months had passed, and the investigators still did not have a prime suspect against whom they could bring an official charge. Law enforcement officers questioned 38 individuals who had somehow crossed paths with the girl on that fateful evening. 6 of them were detained, as they fit the description. The police were particularly interested in Frank Daly, the manager of the pizzeria where Sharon was going to hang out. But in the end, everyone was released for lack of evidence. The victim's close friends were not overlooked either. All of them had alibis. Some were hanging out at the pizzeria, while others were watching a sports match at home. Gradually, the investigation reached a dead end. No fresh information was coming in, and all leads and clues turned out to be false. It seemed that the investigation had completely stalled everyone except the girls. Mother had given up. The woman could not come to terms with the loss, and continued to search for at least some details that would shed light on the circumstances of her daughter's death. She understood that on that evening, Sharon could hardly have walked far from the house. Around the same time the girl headed for the pizzeria, one of their neighbors was supposed to be returning from work. For years, he had been walking the same route every day. That ill-fated day was no exception, but the man claimed that he had not seen the girl on the trail. Considering that Sharon did not make it to Berina, she must have been intercepted almost immediately after parting with her friend. The perpetrator had a very narrow time window, but he managed to fit into it perfectly to abduct the schoolgirl without being seen by anyone. The investigators never managed to find a witness to the attack. It was as if it were the perfect crime. The grief-stricken mother was convinced that it was worth taking a closer look at all the residents of their street. One of them might have noticed a suspicious stranger, or recognized him if the attacker himself lived nearby. The detectives were inclined to believe that the killer and rapist was a fairly young guy who most likely still lived with his parents. In their opinion, he had certain mental deviations, perverted fantasies, or something similar that provoked rage and hatred towards women in him. The police suspected that this attack was not his first, and if the maniac was not stopped soon, it might not be the last. The investigators were also sure that several people were involved in the abduction and abuse of poor Sharon. The investigators considered the possibility that the elusive knife-wielding attacker who had assaulted another girl named Cheryl around the same time might have been involved in the crime. Back then, he was thwarted by passers-by, so the perpetrator was forced to flee. Thanks to witnesses, a verbal portrait of this man was compiled, but despite all the efforts of the police, he still could not be found. The likelihood that 2 maniac kidnappers would be operating simultaneously in one of the city's quietest neighborhoods was extremely low. Therefore, the detectives assumed that the attack on Cheryl and Sharon's murder were committed by the same person. The criminal's behavior indicated that he was well-oriented in the area. He managed to move about unnoticed, leaving no traces, and arousing no suspicion among local residents. The investigators agreed with the victim's mother most likely. The killer lived somewhere nearby. His nature was defined as sadistic. People with such perversions usually act according to a certain pattern. At first they present themselves as charming and sweet, trying to attract gullible victims. Having lured them into their nets, the sadists become increasingly cruel and demanding with each step. It all starts with control, then comes the turn of humiliation and outright abuse. It is according to this scenario that their love affairs with women often develop. But eventually, even this is not enough for the pervert. He turns into a predator who goes out to hunt for new victims. Given this, the police considered it necessary to carefully check all residents of the neighborhood who had convictions for harassment and domestic violence. But first and foremost, the investigators sought to track down the mysterious knife-wielding attacker who had targeted Cheryl. He fit the killer's profile perfectly: low communication skills, since he preferred to communicate with the help of a cold weapon, lack of success in life, and low intelligence. This personality type literally left its imprint on Sharon's mutilated body. Judging by the severity of the beatings, he was accustomed to getting his way not by persuasion or cunning, but by brute force. Obviously, the maniac could not restrain himself, easily flaring up with anger and instantly resorting to violence. The most terrifying realization was that the police were probably dealing with a serial killer who needed to be stopped as soon as possible. At the moment, the murderer was one step ahead of his pursuers. The law enforcement officers were making every effort to track him down, but at that time, many modern technologies that greatly facilitate the work of investigators did not yet exist. DNA analysis, surveillance cameras, tracking phones by geolocation, and so on. The detectives' hands were tied. They were acting too slowly and unprofessionally. The killer took advantage of this to strike again. 6 years after the discovery of Sharon's mutilated body, a 12-year-old schoolgirl named Tammy Lakey became the sadist's victim. It is quite possible that the inhuman decided to switch to defenseless little girls, confident in his impunity after the massacre of 16-year-old Sharon. The examination of Tammy's remains was carried out by the same experts who had investigated the murder of the maniac's first victim. They immediately noticed the striking similarity in the criminal's modus operandi, which became additional evidence in favor of the serial killer theory. On March 20th, 1981, Tammy Lakey was visiting her grandmother. Like the previous victim, the girl disappeared a few blocks from the house where she was staying. The elderly woman was unwell and asked her granddaughter to go to the store, but she never returned. The only find on the girl's way to the store was her glasses, which were lying on the sidewalk. They were noticed by the schoolgirl's mother when she was returning home. The frightened woman immediately reported her daughter's disappearance to the police. Soon, a witness was found who had seen a man in a beige raincoat jump out of a small red car and forcibly push a screaming girl into the vehicle. That same evening, a barely alive Tammy was discovered out in the open. A man called the police station and told them about the terrible find. The poor girl was lying on the ground naked, covered only with her own clothes. Medics desperately fought for the child's life, but the injuries were incompatible with life. The girl had been strangled. Although there were no signs of rape on her body, traces of male semen were found on her belongings. As in the previous case, the attacker acted sloppily, leaving behind a lot of evidence. But none of it brought the investigation closer to solving these horrific crimes. Despite the persistent efforts of the detectives, the investigation reached a dead end. At this time, similar attacks on young girls and little girls were also taking place in neighboring regions of Canada. In particular, in 1978, the body of 17-year-old Lisa Blaze was found dead in Montreal, just a few meters from her own home. Early in the morning, she was returning from a disco club when someone hit her hard on the head, raped, and killed her. The perpetrators of this crime were never found. There were so many similar cases that the police were simply lost in speculation as to whether all these cases were connected. In 2000, Sharon's mother turned to the police once again. The woman insisted on reanalyzing all the materials in her daughter's case. In the quarter century that had passed since then, science and technology had made a huge leap forward. Forensic scientists had at their disposal new, more effective, and accurate methods, particularly DNA analysis. But the answer that the grief-stricken mother received by mail a week later struck her to the very heart. It turned out that most of the physical evidence collected in the year of Sharon's death had mysteriously disappeared back in 1995. Among the few surviving items were only the girl's clothing and that of the alleged suspect. Forensic experts carefully examined the man's shirt found at the crime scene. They managed to isolate a DNA sample that did not belong to the victim herself. However, even after cross-referencing with the genetic profile database, no match could be found. The obtained biological material was carefully preserved for future comparison with samples from potential suspects. Later, this find became the key to solving the chilling case. In June 2004, the police received information about a garage where the killer might have helped Sharon captive. The detectives immediately went to the site, but despite a thorough search, they could not find a single piece of physical evidence that would tie the premises to the crime. Law enforcement officers seized 3 DNA samples, but none of them matched either the genetic material of the deceased schoolgirl or the biological traces on her clothing. In the end, this lead was deemed unpromising. The next unexpected turn in this high-profile case occurred in 2012. An unknown benefactor publicly announced a substantial monetary reward, as much as $10,000 for any information that would help track down the brutal murderer who had taken the lives of 2 young girls. This event suggested that the investigation had made progress, and the police had some new data at their disposal. For the convenience of all concerned citizens who would like to share their guesses and speculations with law enforcement, a special telephone hotline was opened. Although the investigation continued, as dozens of times before, no breakthrough was achieved. The investigators returned once again to the Unsolved episode with the attack on Cheryl, hoping to finally establish the identity of the perpetrator. The girl who had chased away the knife-wielding attacker and managed to get a good look at his face agreed to undergo a hypnosis session. In an altered state of consciousness, she was shown photographs of various men, including the infamous serial killer William Patrick Fife. It was him that the witness identified as bearing a strong resemblance to that man. Patrick turned out to be a Canadian maniac, whose guilt in the deaths of 5 women in Montreal was proven in court. Although he himself claimed that he had at least 9 victims, the rest of the bodies could not be found. The detectives had long suspected that Fife might be involved in the murders of young girls, and had tried in every way to find a connection between him and these chilling crimes. However, the experienced murderer persistently denied his guilt, claiming that he had first taken someone's life no earlier than 1979. Recall that Sharon was brutally killed back in 1975. The charges against Patrick in this case remained mere assumptions. Later, law enforcement officers tried to link the deaths of the schoolgirls with other dangerous Canadian criminals. Suspicion fell on Mike French, a member of the notorious Montreal motorcycle club, the Satans. In 1975, when the bloody massacre of Sharon took place, Mike lived in the same area, and 2 years later, he moved to another city with his parents. French acquaintances characterized him as an extremely aggressive and cruel person, quite capable of killing a child. There were even several witnesses who allegedly heard Mike boasting about his involvement in Sharon's brutal murder. But here too, fortune turned its back on the law enforcers. In November 1982, during a bloody showdown between rival gangs, French was shot dead. He took all the secrets about his possible involvement in the attacks on the girls to his grave. By the way, the police failed to solve his own death as well. But all these versions remained nothing more than theoretical speculations, which had no solid evidence to support them. The inconsolable Pryor family was extremely disappointed with the unprofessionalism of the investigators, who were unable to establish the identity of the real killer. The relatives of the deceased swore to seek just punishment for the scoundrel who had abused their child until their last breath. Sharon's mother viewed this grueling fight not only as a matter of honor for her family, but also as a moral obligation to all parents whose children were ruined by perverts and sadists. In 2019, the disconsolate woman took part in the filming of a TV show, along with 9 other families devastated by similar tragedies. They publicly accused law enforcement of incompetence and negligence. Police representatives refused to be present in the studio during the interview. The long-awaited breakthrough in this high-profile case did not occur until June 2022. Thanks to the latest advances in genetic genealogy, experts managed to find a DNA profile in the database that matched the sample taken from the man's shirt at the scene of Sharon's murder. The most likely owner of the genetic material turned out to be Franklin Romine, who had died under mysterious circumstances back in 1982. His remains had to be exhumed to carry out all the necessary analyses. On May 23, 2023, the connection between the biological traces found at the crime scene and the DNA of the late Franklin was officially confirmed. Romine's appearance fully matched the characteristics of the suspect provided by witnesses. The man lived in the area where the abduction took place. His car perfectly matched the tire tracks found near the unfortunate Sharon's body. Franklin had a dark criminal past. In particular, he had already been convicted of assault and rape. All these facts finally allowed the dots to be connected in this chilling story. There was no one to put in the dock, of course, but at least the investigators were able to officially close the case and inform the victim's relatives who had committed this heinous crime. The murder of the 16-year-old schoolgirl was solved thanks to modern DNA analysis techniques and the persistence of her loved ones, who had tirelessly sought the truth for nearly half a century. This is where our today's Case 6 comes to an end. Case 7. Michalina Lewandowska was born in Poland to parents Jan and Miroslava Lewandowska. The couple had 2 other daughters in addition to Michalina. In 2005, when Michalina was 21, she met 19-year-old Marcin Kasprzyk. They met in a shop near her parents' home in Lesicin, a village in southwest Poland. The couple began dating, and within a year, Marcin proposed to Michalina. The couple moved from Poland to the UK in 2006 to find work and begin their new life together. In the UK, they moved into Marcin's parents' home in Finade Bridge. Their relationship had its ups and downs, but toward the end of 2007, Michalina was pregnant, and the couple welcomed his son in April of 2008. They named him Jakub. As the relationship continued to deteriorate, the couple called off the engagement. They still continued to live together, however, and Michalina held out hope that they'd work through their problems, particularly since they had a child. She continued to wear her engagement ring, never losing hope. But by 2011, it was clear to both Michalina and Marcin that there was no future for their relationship. Marcin didn't spend any time with Michalina, preferring to, instead, spend every day at the gym bodybuilding. Until one day, Marcin invited Michalina to take in some shopping with him and his friend, 18-year-old Patrick Boris. Given that Marcin had not wanted to spend any time with Michalina whatsoever recently, she was surprised but pleased. She wondered whether this might be a turning point, suspecting that Marcin's feelings may be softening toward her. With their 3-year-old son Jakub staying with Marcin's mother that day, Michalina eagerly went to put her makeup on in the bathroom. She could faintly hear the men outside of the bathroom talking. When she emerged from the bathroom, she immediately encountered Marcin and Patrick, with what she called a chilling smile on their faces. Without time to process what was happening, Marcin told Michalina that he wanted to show her something. That something was a 300,000-volt stun gun. He pulled it out of his pocket and told her he was going to show her how it worked. Then he shoved it against her neck. The electric shock the taser sent through her body was massive and agonizing. Marcin threw her to the floor and tossed her. She screamed for him to stop, but he was too strong. As she was convulsing in pain, the 220-pound or 100-kilogram bodybuilder put his knee and entire body weight on her chest to keep her down. At some point, he paused long enough for her to ask him if he planned to kill her. He told her that he was just taking her somewhere and to not be scared. Marcin and Patrick then used packing tape to cover Michalina's mouth and bind her wrists and ankles. Once fully bound, they tossed her again, then left her lie in the hallway for 6 hours. Michalina's mind raced. When the attack first began, she surmised that it may be some sort of cruel joke. But as she lay there barely conscious, it became clear what the 2 men's intentions were. She was determined to stay conscious, unsure of whether she'd ever wake up again if she did not. After nightfall arrived, the 2 men dragged a terrified Michalina into the kitchen. There, they discussed using a plastic bag, and Michalina was certain they were going to use one to suffocate her. But they didn't. Instead, they stuffed the fully bound young woman into a cardboard box, then began tightly securing it with packing tape. Michalina was not going down without a fight, though. She tried to scream through the tape covering her mouth, but Marcin just laughed and told her as calmly as someone exchanging "I have handed you for 4 years. You will never see your son again." Michalina would later recall, "I will never forget the look on his face." He was incredibly calm, which was even more worrying. The attackers finished sealing the box, carried it to Patrick's trunk, and placed it inside. They then drove quite a distance from what Michalina could tell. It was a remote wooded area. The men removed the box from the trunk and dragged their heavy cargo along the ground, Michalina feeling every painful rock they passed over on her back. The pair had pre-dug a shallow grave. They placed the box inside, then used a shovel to dump soil on top of her. And for good measure, they also placed an 88-pound or 40-kilogram tree trunk on top of the box to ensure Michalina would never get out alive. From within her cardboard prison, Michalina could hear a shovel digging the dirt, then the dirt hitting the box. She strained to hear what they were saying. She thought to herself, "This is it, I'm going to die." Still in intense pain, with her cramped and contorted position making it even worse, Michalina began to worry about suffocating. So she tried to calm herself and begin breathing as shallowly as possible. She laid still, listening for the sound of her attacker's car driving off. She didn't dare attempt to escape if they were still there, knowing they would kill her if she were somehow able to emerge. She thought of her son and knew she had to escape for him. She refused to die and leave him motherless, and the thought of never seeing him again was too much to bear. So she waited and listened, but she didn't hear any sounds of a car leaving. So after it had been so long, she had to risk it. She thought surely they had to have left by now. It was time to strategize. She was helpless and pain-contorted, bound and buried alive in a cardboard box. Then, she suddenly realized that she actually had something that could help her. Ironically, it was the very thing that Marchin had given her to symbolize their love, her diamond engagement ring. She took it off and used the sharp edges of the diamond to first cut the tape around her wrists, and then her ankles. Then, she put it back on and went for the cardboard. She just kept cutting and slashing at it with her ring until she could get her hand through a hole. Then, she began frantically pulling and tearing where she made the hole, but the dirt just fell through it. It was all over her clothes, her hair, her face. Having also removed the tape on her mouth, she began screaming in hopes that someone would hear her and come save her. Receiving no response, she started kicking and clawing at the cardboard again. She was incredibly weak, but just kept trying. Then, she somehow managed a hole large enough in the box to fit her head through, and she pushed up as hard as she could through the earth until her head emerged through the top. It was still dark, but she could see trees, leaves, and the sky. She was desperate for the fresh air and took in as much as she could. She was covered in dirt and exhausted, but there was still much to be done. As far as she could tell, she was in the middle of nowhere, and getting her head out was not going to be enough to save her in the darkness of night with a variety of wildlife in the area. She was able to force her arms above the surface. That was the turning point for her. Once she achieved that, she knew she would make it. After having been buried alive for nearly an hour, Michalina freed the rest of her body. Then, fully exhausted, she staggered from the woods onto the road. She saw a car approaching and flagged it down. Thankfully, the driver stopped and was helpful. He called the police, who arrived within 15 minutes. She shared her harrowing story with them, then took them back to where she had emerged from her cardboard coffin. Police promptly located and arrested Marchin. They brought him in on suspicion of kidnapping and attempted murder. Marchin did not deny the attack, but claimed that he was not trying to kill Michalina. He told them he merely intended to scare her and was going to return to retrieve her. But they couldn't buy it, particularly since they quickly discovered that after burying Michalina, Marchin and Patrick used her ATM card to withdraw £500, then return home to play video games. By the time the investigation and subsequent trial were complete, they learned the true story. 25-year-old Marchin was an avid bodybuilder and had developed an addiction to anabolic steroids. That addiction often caused him to experience fits of rage. And once he learned that Michalina decided to leave him and return to Poland with their son, he decided to dispose of Michalina and raise Jakub, along with the help of his own mother. He concluded that the two of them could do a better job than Michalina. They learned that Marchin told Michalina that she was not as attractive as the women he saw at the gym, and that he had changed his Facebook status to single, hoping to start a relationship with another woman. Then, when he put his murder plan into action, he was disappointed because they didn't perform as advertised. He expected it to paralyze Michalina. In court, Michalina, who spoke Polish, described her experience through an interpreter. He was putting the soil on top of me. I wanted to reply. I wanted to put my 2 fingers through the hole, but I was afraid if he could see it, he may break my fingers with the shovel. She continued, I thought about my ring, that I could take it off my finger and try to cut the tape with it. She described how she could hear music from a nearby pub, so she knew she couldn't be too far from civilization. Marchin's defense then tried to argue the same thing Marchin told police, that he did not intend to kill her, but was only trying to scare her. He noted how the box the men placed Michalina in had 2 hand holes, through which she could breathe. To that, Michalina replied, I can tell you now that they, referring to the hand holes, were not left specially or intentionally for me to live. The prosecution showed photos of the box in which Michalina was imprisoned, and the trail of clothing leading from a hole at one end of the box. They described how police had to remove dirt to reveal parts of the box below. In January of 2020, Marcin Kasperczak was convicted of attempted murder and kidnapping and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Patrick Borys was found not guilty of attempted murder, but was found guilty of kidnapping and sentenced to 4.5 years. Both men were required to serve at least half of their sentences before they would be eligible for parole. But that half-sentence requirement won't matter for Marcin. Once he was arrested, investigators searched the home of his parents where he, Michalina, and their son were living. There they found equipment and supplies for making explosives. Marcin pleaded guilty to 8 counts of illegal possession of explosive substances and was sentenced to 4 years in prison for each count, 32 years in total to be added on to his 20-year sentence for attempted murder. Michalina was relocated to a secret location far away from where the attempted murder took place. However, she still lives in fear of him. After the verdict, she issued statements, including, "He buried me alive and walked away thinking I would die there cold and alone in that terrible box. He wished for my death and planned to kill me in the most horrifying way imaginable. But I didn't allow him to succeed. Using the last shreds of my strength, I fought my way out of that grave. Now it is he who is imprisoned." After the verdict, Michalina's father shared his feelings about the verdict and Marcin. He said that he knew Marcin was trouble from the moment he met him. He added, "I always knew something wasn't right about Marcin right from the start. We didn't make eye contact. He was spoiled and overprotected, maybe because he is an only child and a mummy's boy. His mother kept him cooped up in a cage like a chicken all his life, so when he went out into the world, he didn't really know what to do." Michalina's mother, Miroslava, also shared, "I am so happy by the verdict because for me, it means peace at last. I was waking up at night, having nightmares in which I saw Marcin's face. He was haunting me like a ghost. We loved the poetic justice of this case. Marcin felt he had the right to take away someone else's freedom and life because he wanted to. And in the end, it was his own freedom that was taken away. And were it not for the additional crimes he was convicted of, he would be free far too soon. But whatever, just so long as he remains unfree for as long as possible." Case 8. It's the middle of the night. In 27-year-old Alison Bota, having just been brutally attacked, has just watched her assailants finally drive away, leaving her for dead. Having been stabbed 37 times in the abdomen and 17 times in the neck, she pondered just laying there and allowing the inevitable to happen. But she didn't. Instead, recognizing the gaping hole in her abdomen and her intestines spilling out from it, she tucked them in as best she could and used a shirt to hold them in place. Then, she somehow managed to get to her feet to search and hope for help. But the moment she stood up, her head began to tilt backward, and she noticed that her vision was fading in and out. So she put her hand to her neck and realized that she had been nearly decapitated, which was making her head shift out of place. She would have to walk with one hand holding her head in place and the other supporting her intestines. This case is made doubly rare by both the extreme brutality of the attack and the attackers, as well as the miraculous survival of the victim, especially given the incomprehensible extent of her injuries. Let's dive in. Located on the southeastern coast of South Africa, sits the vibrant coastal city of Port Elizabeth. Bordering the Indian Ocean, the city is known for its beautiful beaches as well as being relaxed and laid back. Port Elizabeth is where Alison Bota was born on September 22, 1967, to parents Claire and Brian Bota. Alison's parents would separate when she was 10, after which she lived with her mother and her older brother. Alison was a bright student, excelling academically, and even achieving the esteemed position of head girl at the Collegiate High School for Girls in Port Elizabeth. After graduating high school, she took a few years off to travel and discover herself before returning to Port Elizabeth, where she began a new job as an insurance broker. Alison was happy and content with family, friends, and limitless possibilities before her. That was until she encountered Frans du Toit and the Uns Kruger. Frans du Toit was a 26-year-old father and husband with a long and extensive criminal history, dating back to his childhood. He had an early fascination with arson, having set fire to a school during his teenage years. His crimes would escalate over the years, and eventually he became known for his violent attacks against women. But despite multiple accusations of rape, he would get off nearly every time with a minor slap on the wrist. Many speculate that it was due to his father's position as a police officer. In contrast to Du Toit, 19-year-old the Uns Kruger came from a deeply abusive background. Instead of having a police officer as his dad, Kruger's father was a career criminal, spending most of his life behind bars. And while his buddy Frans considered himself a ladies' man, Kruger knew that he didn't stand a chance. He was neither good-looking nor smart, and he was aware that women found him repulsive. It was the constant rejection from them that fueled his deep-seated anger toward women. With both men feeling socially alienated, Du Toit and Kruger bonded in their shared deviance and callous disregard for others. Both also dabbled in Satanism. The duo was dangerous, and sadly, Alison Botha would soon find this out. On December 18, 1994, Alison Botha had just enjoyed a day at the beach in Port Elizabeth with some friends. Afterwards, she invited them back to her apartment, where they would continue their evening with games and pizza for dinner. As the evening came to a close, most of the friends headed home. The last friend, however, did not have a ride home. Given safety concerns in the neighborhood after dark, Alison offered to drive the friend home, an offer that would change the course of her life. After safely dropping off her friend, Alison returned home just after 3 o'clock in the morning. Someone had taken her usual parking space, so she was forced to find a different parking spot further away from her apartment. Alison parked her car in the new spot. Then she reached over to retrieve a bag of clean laundry from the passenger seat. That's when she felt a wave of warm air, just as her driver's door swung open. The man outside her door pressed a knife against Alison's throat and told her to move over, or I'll kill you. The assailant told her that his name was Clinton, but he would later be identified as Franz Du Toit. He assured her that he only needed her car, and that as long as she obeyed, he wouldn't harm her. Alison gave him her car keys, as he demanded. Gripped by terror, she remained silent as the man took control of the wheel. They would pick up another man, Theums Kruger, before venturing into the deserted outskirts of the city. As they traveled down the dark, deserted path, Alison caught the eyes of the second man in the rearview mirror. Unlike the driver, who at least pretended to be friendly, the man in the back made no such effort. He glared at her like a hunter glares at his vulnerable prey. She knew she was in trouble, and began to dread that she might not make it out of this situation alive. Once they'd reached a secluded location far from any witnesses or potential rescuers, the two men locked their eyes onto Alison. Then they revealed to her their brutal intentions. They openly confessed their vile plan to rape her. They asked Alison if she would fight back. Overwhelmed by fear, Alison said no. Alison was pulled out of the car and callously thrown onto the ground atop piles of broken glass, dirt, and debris. The first man, Franz Du Toit, sexually assaulted Alison before passing her over to Theums Kruger, who proceeded to viciously and brutally rape her as well. Given their prior arrests on rape charges, the two men reached a chilling conclusion. In order to evade justice for their crime, they would have to leave no witnesses behind and escalate their crime to murder. So while he was raping Alison, Kruger tightened his grip around her throat, attempting to choke the life out of her during the assault. The strangulation resulted in a loss of bodily functions, and Alison evacuated her bowels, a reflex that would later prove to be life-saving. The strangulation caused her to drift in and out of consciousness, but she was still alive. Frustrated that she didn't seem to be dying, the pair decided to take the more brutal definitive route of stabbing Alison. They'd stab her 37 times in the abdomen. The attack was so vicious and concentrated in her abdominal area. Her flesh was torn wide open and her organs exposed. With such a brutal attack, Franz and Theums were certain that she was dead, until Alison's leg twitched. So, in a final bid to end Alison's life, the pair ruthlessly inflicted an additional 17 stab wounds directly to her neck. Amidst the haze of her fading consciousness, Alison could see the vague silhouette of an arm swaying back and forth in front of her face, accompanied by a sickening wet sound, which she would soon realize was her own flesh being slashed open. She would later recall that, "All I could see was an arm moving above my face. His movements were making a sound, a wet sound. It was the sound of my flesh being slashed open. He was cutting my throat with a knife. I felt no pain, but it was not a dream." "Do you think she's dead?" one of the attackers asked. The other replied, "No one can survive that." Satisfied that Alison was, indeed, dead, Franz de Troyes and Theums Kruger talked amongst themselves, using each other's real names as they climbed back into Alison's car to drive back to the city. Leaving her for dead would turn out to be the deadly pair's costly mistake. Alison was lying on the ground, severely injured but miraculously still breathing. She was sure she was going to die, but was determined to leave a message behind before she did. She used her fingers to scrawl 2 names into the dirt, Franz and Theums. Below the names of her attackers, she added another message, this time to her family, "I love Mom." But despite her dire situation, and how easy it would be to just succumb to her life-threatening injuries, Alison was not ready to give up. She could see headlights in the distance through the bushes. If she could make it to the road, she may have a chance at survival. So despite her exhaustion and the overwhelming odds against her, Allison mustered enough strength to start moving. While she continued to drift in and out of consciousness, her first order of business was to somehow secure her organs that were by now spilling out of the gaping hole in her abdomen. Having been stripped naked, she found her denim shirt nearby and tied it around her body in an attempt to hold her intestines in place. But it was not very secure. She initially started crawling, but then quickly realized that crawling was too time-consuming, so she decided to rise to her feet and walk. But after standing up, her head unexpectedly shifted backward and her vision faded in and out. Her attackers had sliced into her neck so extensively that she was nearly decapitated. She had no choice but to walk with one hand supporting her intestines and the other holding her head in place. She would later recall, "I pulled my head forward with my free hand and my vision returned, at least temporarily. I fell many times, but managed to get up again until I finally reached the road." On the road is where Allison's luck would finally change. Once she arrived, she was thoroughly exhausted. But despite her condition and all that she'd endured, she had the presence of mind to target the best place to position herself to draw attention. She collapsed in the middle of the road on the white line. She remembers a car approaching after that, slowing down, but then continuing on once they saw her naked, bloodied, brutalized body. Then another car. This one contained some vacationing friends from Johannesburg, one of whom was Tyann Eilert, a young veterinary student. Tyann and his friends were horrified at the sight of the bloodied, mutilated body in the road and immediately stopped to help. Tyann leaped out of the car, taking Allison's trembling hand. He offered what comfort he could to the barely conscious Allison. Drawn on his veterinary knowledge, he tended to her exposed thyroid and fashioned his shirt into a makeshift bandage to stem a flow of blood from Allison's ravaged neck. To keep her conscious, Tyann asked Allison simple questions. Without the ability to speak, Allison communicated by silently squeezing the stranger's hand, once for yes, twice for no. Tyann would later recall, "God put me on that road that night for a reason." He would spend a full 45 minutes talking with her, asking questions and comforting her, until an ambulance finally arrived after what should have been just a 15-minute drive. The paramedics' expressions upon first seeing Allison were telling. Anyone who saw her didn't think that she would make it through such a brutal attack. When it was time to move Allison to the ambulance, she refused to let go of Tyann's hand, so he rode along with her to the hospital. The hospital staff were shocked by the severity of Allison's injuries upon her arrival. One doctor, Alexander Angelov, later said that he'd never seen such severe injuries in his 16 years of practicing medicine. Despite being stabbed over 50 times miraculously, none of them hit any vital organs or arteries. And since her intestines had been emptied as a result of being strangled, her abdominal cavity never turned septic. An extremely life-threatening infection brought on by bacteria, common to originate in the intestines. And she also didn't develop any infections, even though her gaping wounds were covered with dirt. Defying all expectations, Allison managed to survive the extensive 3-hour surgery. As a result of her throat injuries, a breathing tube was inserted into her windpipe, and even though she was not able to speak, she was still able to identify the 2 men responsible from a photo lineup presented by detectives. She remembered everything about the attack, which helped authorities arrest Detroys and Kruger. Given their extensive criminal records, apprehending Detroys and Kruger was a straightforward task for the detectives. They were arrested the following day and presented to Allison in an in-person lineup. They utilized a one-way mirror to shield Allison from being seen by her attackers, South Africa's very first use of such a mirror. Although the pair attempted to alter their appearance, Allison easily picked them out of the lineup. Dubbed the Ripper Rapist by the media, the despicable pair faced a litany of charges, including kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder. When police brought Detroys in for questioning about Allison, he assumed it was regarding her murder, so when they informed him that she was still alive, he promptly confessed. He handed over a ring caked in blood that belonged to Allison. They definitely had their man. Detroys then claimed that he was possessed by a demon and needed an exorcism. Surprisingly, authorities arranged for a man in the cloth to perform the ritual, but not even an exorcism could protect Allison's assailants from facing justice. On June 12, 1995, the trial began. One of the defense lawyers withdrew to services for ethical reasons after familiarizing himself with the details of the case. Allison was able to face her attackers and testify against them. 3 other women would also step forward, a student who had earlier been raped by Detroit's, and a pregnant woman who had been raped by the two men just weeks before Allison's horrific attack. The attackers had warned the pregnant victim to not go to the police, which she promptly did once she was released. This likely fueled their determination to never leave any future witnesses alive. Sadly, after the pair had been arrested for the attack on the pregnant victim, they were quickly released. The third woman who came forward had narrowly escaped the same harrowing fate around the same time as Allison's attack. She had noticed two men watching her as she pulled into a parking spot. She was quick to lock the doors as they sprinted towards her car. She would later recognize the two men from the news reports about Allison as the same men from that night. With the overwhelming evidence against them and impactful testimonies from their victims, on August 7, 1995, the verdict came back. Guilty on all charges. Horrified by the level of cruelty and violence in the case, the judge sentenced Franz Detroit's to 3 life sentences, while Fritz Kruber received 1 life sentence plus 25 years. Judge Chris Jansen would recall, "I needed to make it clear that they were a threat to society and should never be released." Unfortunately, all prisoners sentenced before October 2004 in South Africa are eligible for parole. Following the trial, Allison Botha descended into depression, not surprising given the harrowing experience she had endured. However, a ray of hope emerged when she reconnected with a friend who shared his own traumas and mental health struggles. Their connection deepened, leading to their marriage in February 1997 and later welcoming 2 sons. The encounter with Allison Botha that fateful night profoundly impacted Tyan Eilert, the young man who bravely came to her rescue. Tyan realized that his true calling lay in the field of medicine, where he would make a lasting difference in the lives of others. Motivated by the life-altering experience, he made the bold decision to change career paths to become a doctor. He and Allison remain friends to this day, and he even assisted with the delivery of one of Allison's sons. Over time, Allison channeled her nightmarish ordeal into a beacon of hope. In 1998, she published her survival memoir titled I Have Life, which resonated worldwide and became a bestseller, translated into 7 languages. Inspired by her remarkable story, Allison became a sought-after motivational speaker, traveling extensively to share her experiences and inspire other victims. Amidst these triumphs, a production company approached Allison to adapt her story into a film. She agreed to collaborate with director and writer Yuga Carlini, whose passion for her story was ignited by one of Allison's powerful speeches. During filming, Franz Detroit's contacted Carlini using a prison warden's cell phone. Despite inflicting unimaginable pain upon Allison and countless other women, he shamelessly offered an on-camera interview in exchange for a signed letter of forgiveness from Allison and profits from her book and speeches. He claimed that he was entitled to part of the profits since without him, she wouldn't have a story to tell. His offer was emphatically declined. The film was finished and released in 2016, becoming the first movie in the history of South African cinema to be selected for the Dance with Films of Los Angeles Indie Fest. In 2016, the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University honored Allison with the Council Prestige Award, recognizing her commitment to empowering others. Franz Detroit is currently serving his sentence at Groovelay Prison, a maximum security prison located in the Free State province of South Africa, and housing inmates convicted of serious offenses. Thunes Kruger spends his days locked away in CMAX prison, located in Pretoria, South Africa. It is one of the most secure prisons in the country, housing inmates who, like Kruger, have been convicted of serious and violent crimes. It's designed to minimize the risk of escape and maintain a high level of security at all times. As of the making of this video in 2023, neither Franz Detroit nor Thunes Kruger have been granted parole. They remain in prison for their crimes. Case 9. By most anyone's standards, Sabrina Zunnick had a rough start in life. Struggling with drug and alcohol addiction, her parents, Susan Edwards and Mark Zunnick, spent most of their adult life in trouble with the law, typically caught between a revolving door of prison and probation. 10 years before Sabrina was born, her mother Susan spent 6 months in Marysville prison after being convicted of grand theft. And her father, diagnosed with schizophrenia, was known by police as a local drug dealer. By the time Sabrina was born on October 27, 1994, the couple had a string of charges and were crippled with addiction. Mark Zunnick's mother advised him to visit a doctor about his mental health, but he refused and continued to deteriorate until Sabrina was placed in the care of her grandmother. By the age of 4, Sabrina was diagnosed with ADHD and struggled to connect with children her age. As a teenager, she attended Wycliffe High School in Cleveland, where she was regularly disciplined for behavioral problems. At Wycliffe, Sabrina continued to struggle to connect with her peers, and many times she was removed from public areas after getting into aggressive fights with classmates. Eventually, at age 14, Sabrina was surrendered to the care system and sent to a group home run by Children's Services on the outskirts of Painesville. Sabrina would spend the next several years in and out of state care in different group homes. As she struggled through her teenage years, she was eventually diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder, bipolar disorder, anxiety, and depression. In July of 2011, things finally began to look up for 16-year-old Sabrina. She was placed with the Neefels. Kevin and Lisa Neefel resided in Willoughby Hills, Ohio with their 2 daughters, Megan from Lisa's first marriage and their younger daughter, Haley. Lisa was a dedicated social worker who specialized in child abuse cases. She was committed to helping children in need, which led the couple to become foster parents. Kevin was a truck driver who worked long hours to help support the family. Sabrina quickly settled into the couple's home, which featured a sizable playhouse, swings, a trampoline, and a slide in the front yard. She would spend hours outside playing with her new sisters. Within 5 months of Sabrina being placed with the Neefels, she had begun getting good grades in school for the first time in her life. However, life at home wasn't as smooth as it seemed. Problems began to surface as Sabrina grew increasingly jealous of Megan and Haley, convinced that her foster parents favored the 2 girls over her, and resenting the preferential treatment she believed they received. Sabrina directed much of her anger toward Lisa, leading to regular arguments between the two. With tensions running high, Sabrina found herself growing closer to Kevin, who would return from his long trips and try to calm the situations. The couple reminded themselves about the horrific upbringing that Sabrina had and took steps to try to make her feel more included. Kevin would take Sabrina out alone to both appease his wife and to help Sabrina settle into family life. But that was where the issues began. As Sabrina and Kevin grew closer, family and friends would notice strange behavior between the pair. They were overly friendly, and instead of acting like a father and daughter, they would make uncomfortable sexual jokes in front of others. Lisa also picked up on the oddness of their interactions. She even sent text messages to Kevin about it. In them, she wrote, "By the spring of 2012, Kevin and Sabrina were having a full-blown affair." Despite the 25-year age gap between 17-year-old Sabrina and 42-year-old Kevin, since Ohio's legal age of consent is 16, the relationship between the two was actually legal based on age alone. But given the authority that parents have in such a relationship, it is extremely illegal for foster parents to be involved in romantic relationships with their fosters, no matter their age. Kevin groomed Sabrina, sleeping with her in and out of their shared home, and he would pay her for photos of herself to look at while he was away for work. The pair snuck around together without Lisa's knowledge, laughing at her for being so trusting and believing that Kevin was really helping Sabrina. Over the course of that summer, Lisa and Kevin fought often, and the subject of divorce was mentioned. Not wanting to lose Sabrina, Kevin even spoke with a social worker about the possibility of Sabrina staying under his care if they were to divorce. Meanwhile, Kevin and Sabrina continued their affair. Kevin would get up early to drop Sabrina off at Willoughby South High School and pull over during the ride to have relations with her. By all accounts, Sabrina was thriving at her new school. She was always on time, never failed a class, and had begun speaking with her teachers about the possibility of going to cosmetology school once she graduated. Kevin promised Sabrina that he would divorce Lisa, and the pair could live freely as a couple and raise his daughter Haley together. Sabrina was excited that her life finally seemed to be falling into place. But there was a catch. One day on the way to school, instead of pulling over to connect with his foster daughter, Kevin pulled the car to the side of the road and began sobbing. He told Sabrina how he couldn't take it anymore in detail the fight he had with Lisa the previous evening. Kevin told Sabrina that his wife was worth more to him dead than alive. He told her about an $800,000 life insurance policy they had on Lisa. Kevin outlined how he and Sabrina would have a picture-perfect family life if his wife were out of the way. Then he recruited Sabrina to be the person to make that happen. Sabrina was all in. She agreed to murder the very person who initiated bringing her into their home when she had nowhere else to go. The one person who fought for her when no one else would. Kevin taught her how to stage a scene that would look like a burglary. He showed her techniques on how to stab and murder his wife, including how to use the knife to inflict the most damage. He reassured her that if she was caught, she would only serve 25 years because of her age and background. In Sabrina's manipulated mind, 25 years in prison sounded like a small price to pay to make Kevin happy and to have the dream life he was promising her. He told her that afterward they would buy a house, and that she could be a mother figure at Haley. Once they finalized the details, Sabrina began asking around looking to find and hire a hitman to do the job for her. She asked one of her friends, Autumn Padlock, if she could help her find someone to do the job. Autumn backed away completely, telling Sabrina this was not the road she wanted to go down. Undeterred, Sabrina proceeded with the planning with her eye on the fantasy life Kevin had painted in her mind. Eventually, Autumn moved away, but the conversations of hitman and murder would ultimately resurface and become a key part of the case. On October 27th, Sabrina turned 18. Legally, she should have left the foster care system and Kevin behind. Instead, she petitioned the court to be allowed to stay with the Neefels, citing the need to finish high school. Her request was approved, and just 3 weeks later, on November 16th, the anguished screams of Megan Zanella rang out to a 911 dispatcher. "I can't breathe. You're going to have to take a deep breath. I cannot understand you." 13-year-old Megan had been startled awake by Lisa's screams. Running into her mother's room, she found Sabrina wearing a ski mask and stabbing her mother over and over and over again. While on the phone with 911, Megan pleaded with Sabrina to stop, but she would not. When police arrived, an officer found Sabrina holding a 15-inch knife with a 9-inch blade that had been out of shape due to the intensity of the stabbing. The youngest daughter, Haley, had been hiding in the master bedroom closet. Megan was inconsolable after having just watched her mother being brutally murdered. Lisa had been stabbed 178 times, with wounds to her torso, neck, and head. The wounds were found to be complex, as if Sabrina had twisted the knife inside of Lisa. At the time of the murder, Kevin Naffel was conveniently driving in Michigan. When he came home and was told the news, his reaction seemed a bit off to police. Instead of showing any sign of grief, he seemed more curious than anything else. Sabrina Zunick was taken to the hospital for treatment of the wounds to her hands she had sustained during the attack. 10 hours later, she was taken to the police station for questioning. Following the plan that Kevin had cleverly laid out, Sabrina began to feign memory loss, telling officers that she could not remember the events of the night before. Trying to get Sabrina to crack, detectives try a new line of questioning to try to get an emotional reaction out of Sabrina. "Kevin's a miracle. I mean, he's the one that helps me out because Lisa has Megan to deal with. And so we made agreements a long time ago that if I need anything, that I can go to Kevin." As they had hoped, Sabrina begins to open up about Kevin and how he is the one she goes to whenever she needs something. Detectives find the line of questioning they hope to tap into Sabrina and Lisa's relationship. They hope that going into it from this angle might force Sabrina to reveal her motives behind the sudden attack. Wanting to see Sabrina's reaction to the news that she apparently doesn't remember, police directly tell her that Lisa is dead. With Sabrina still feeling memory loss and appearing distressed to learn of the murder she committed, the police end the interview there. Sabrina was arrested and taken to the Lake County Jail. Then, police were surprised to learn that on the day after his wife was killed, Kevin visited the jail, demanding to see Sabrina. Kevin was turned away, but friends and family continued to note that his behavior did not at all reflect a grieving husband. Over the next few months, police continued to build their case against Sabrina, but they strongly suspected that there was more to the story than a furious teenager attacking her unsuspecting foster mother. Police attempted to question Kevin under the pretense of asking about Lisa's work. "Okay." Police noted how Kevin refused to make eye contact, looked down, and appeared to be nervous when questions were asked about the night of the attack. But Kevin had an alibi. He was over 300 miles away that night, and with Sabrina's silence, police could not build a case. Over the following months after his wife's murder, Kevin wasted no time cashing in on Lisa's life insurance policy. He remodeled his home, took flying lessons, installed a swimming pool, purchased expensive cars, and even bought a $225,000 home in Florida. Far from acting like a grieving husband, Kevin indulged in a lavish lifestyle, seemingly comfortable knowing that the 18-year-old girl he had groomed to do his dirty work was taking the fall for him. His actions spoke volumes, and Sabrina Zunick was watching. Initially, Sabrina refrained from implicating Kevin in the murder. But as she observed his post-crime behavior, collecting life insurance money, accumulating assets, and distancing himself from her, she began feeling abandoned and betrayed. By May 2013, the betrayal drove Sabrina to enter proffer negotiations with detectives. The proffer, which was a first step toward a plea agreement, allowed Sabrina to be completely honest about her role in the murder without it being used against her in court. It gave her the chance to reveal Kevin's role in orchestrating the crime and all of the manipulation that led up to it. Kevin was cooked. With the agreement in place, Sabrina divulged to police that it was Kevin who conspired with her to murder Lisa Naffel. For the first time, Sabrina outlined to detectives the motives for the attack. She described how Kevin had manipulated her into believing that killing Lisa was the only way they could be together. Sabrina told detectives how Kevin said that Lisa was worth more to him dead than alive, and how, after he convinced her to proceed with the murder, Kevin purchased 2 life insurance policies for Lisa, totaling over $750,000. Sabrina said she had been convinced that murder was the only way. She told detectives how, for the first time in her life, she was happy in a home and didn't want anything to take her away from Kevin and the security he provided. So when Kevin came to Sabrina with a plan to murder Lisa, she said she felt that she couldn't say no. With Sabrina's statements, police began building a case against Kevin. In the process, they began reaching out to anyone who might be able to back up Sabrina's version of events. Enter Autumn Pavlik, Sabrina's old friend, who she had once asked to help her find the hitman. Autumn had moved away shortly before Lisa was killed, but always remembered the chilling conversations she had with Sabrina in the weeks leading up to her death. Officers visited Autumn in California and asked her if she would be willing to call Kevin and leave him a message that she needed to speak to him about something important. According to both Sabrina and Autumn, Kevin knew about the hitman request, and detectives were hoping that hearing Autumn's voice again might cause him to panic. It worked. Kevin returned Autumn's call, unaware that the phone call was being recorded by investigators. On the call, Autumn tells Kevin that she is worried about being dragged into the case in the event that the hitman conversation was ever discovered. Kevin reassured Autumn that there was nothing she could be dragged into, but generally remained vague. Since the call didn't yield any useful information, investigators changed tactics. By early July, with Autumn back in Ohio visiting family, they asked her to go to Kevin's home wearing a wire, hoping to catch him off guard. Autumn went inside and stayed for 43 minutes, repeatedly voicing her fears about being arrested over the hitman conversation. Despite her efforts, Kevin continued to deflect, dismissing Autumn's concerns by saying, "Sabrina said a lot of damn things." Investigators would not get any information of value from the conversation, but they were more determined than ever to solidify their case. They looked into Kevin and Sabrina's phone records, desperate to find something that would corroborate Sabrina's confession. It was there that they struck gold. Detectives found that between November 1st and November 16th, 2012, Kevin and Sabrina had exchanged nearly 1,500 text messages, a whopping 78 of which were made in the very short and critical 5 to 6 hour time frame before Lisa's murder. While the details of those text messages were not divulged to the public, they would prove to be one of the final pieces law enforcement needed to solidify their case. On August 9th, 2013, Kevin Naffel was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit aggravated murder, complicity to aggravated murder, and 6 counts of sexual battery. His trial began in May 2014. He argued that Sabrina acted entirely on her own, denying that he had any involvement in the crime. Sabrina's testimony against Kevin played a crucial role in the trial. The jury took just over 9.5 hours to come back with their verdict. They found him guilty on all counts. Kevin Naffel was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Sabrina was tried after Kevin in August of 2014. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. During the sentencing, she read the following statement. "I want to say how sorry I am for all those I hurt. Lisa did not deserve what happened to her. I ask forgiveness be given to me, not for my benefit, but for those who need the healing process to begin. I can't explain how much remorse I have and how much sadness I deal with." After the sentencing, Sabrina's defense attorney spoke out, saying that Kevin hijacked her future, since she will be 47 years old by the time she is likely to be released in 2042. In 2017, a judge awarded $6.2 million in damages to Lisa's daughters, Megan and Haley Naffel. The court held the attacker, Sabrina Zunick, liable for $5 million and Kevin Naffel responsible for $1.2 million. The lawsuit was brought in civil court to compensate the girls for the emotional trauma and loss they suffered as a result of the brutal murder of their mother. As of the making of this video in 2024, Sabrina is now 30 years old and is currently incarcerated at the Dayton Correctional Institution in Ohio. In 2019, she participated in a prison interview for the television series Snapped Behind Bars, where she discussed her involvement in the crime, the events leading up to it, and the extreme remorse she has for what she did. She will be eligible for parole in the year 2042. Kevin Naffel, now 54, is serving his sentence at the Lake Area Correctional Institution, where he was admitted in 2014. He is kept below profile, and there is no publicly available information on his prison life. Given his minimum 30-year sentence, plus the additional 12 years for the sexual battery charge, the Department of Corrections has his expected release or parole eligibility date set to the year 2055. We hope this video did justice to Lisa Naffel. Many expressed mixed emotions about Sabrina. She was clearly the killer, but analysts contend that Kevin knew Sabrina's distinct vulnerabilities, and he played off of those needs to get the outcome he wanted. But does that absolve her of her role in the crime? Should her guilt be weighed based on her having stabbed Lisa 178 times? A number that no one disputes has to have come from a place of rage. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Case 10. A father receives a call at work telling him to come home because there's been an emergency. He rushes home. The front door is locked, so he goes around the house and enters through the back door. There he finds a bloodbath. His 18-year-old daughter is lying on the floor, bludgeoned, stabbed, and murdered. Nearby is his 16-year-old son, who has met the same fate. Fearing the worst for his remaining daughter, an orphan, who the family had recently adopted, he calls out her name, but she doesn't respond. She emerges minutes later with wet hair. The father embraces her and first assumes that the wetness is blood, but it's not. She tells him that she has just taken a bath. He asks her what happened, and she responds that intruders killed her brother and sister while she hid under the bed. But the dad is suspicious, and rightfully so, because, as we'll learn, there was far more to this sweet, innocent orphan girl than anyone could have imagined. The Maguads were a close-knit, loving family who lived in Cotabato, a province in the Philippines. The father of the family, Cruz, was a high school teacher who taught at the local high school, and the mother, Lovella, was a principal at the local elementary school. As educators, they were not wealthy, but they lived comfortably. The couple had 2 children, and in 2021, 18-year-old Crizzle Gwynn was the oldest and was attending nursing school, while their younger child, 16-year-old Crizzle Luis, had his eye on becoming a lawyer. Both were honor students with hearts bigger than life. That same year, 2021, Gwynn met 17-year-old Janice Sebio at an event they were both attending. Janice, who was sometimes referred to in the media as Christine, was there with the family that she worked for, who were friends of the Maguads. Janice and Gwynn instantly hit it off. As the two became closer, both Gwynn and her brother Luis began to learn more about Janice's background. Janice shared that she was an orphan with no memory before the age of 8. She said that she was basically a servant working both day and night for the family that hired her. She looked after their 2 young children, cooked their meals, and cleaned up after them, all of which prevented her from pursuing her education. She said that despite her long hours working, she barely had any money. Both Gwynn and Luis were heartbroken about Janice's desperate and unfortunate situation. So Gwynn pleaded with her parents to adopt Janice to give her a better life and allow her to finish school. The parents were initially reluctant since space in their home was limited, but their children felt so strongly about wanting to help this young orphan that they'd come to love that Luis even selflessly offered to give up his room so that Janice could sleep in it. He offered to sleep on the couch in the living room to make it happen. The parents finally gave in, figuring that they were called on by God to help this young orphan in need. Janice was welcomed into their home and moved into Luis's room. And by July of 2021, the adoption of Janice by the Maguads was official. Both the parents and the children were all in. The parents treated Janice as they did their children, showering her with love, support, and assurances that they'd always be there for her. And Gwynn and Luis continued showing her the friendship and now sibling love that they were so eager to give her. You could see the camaraderie in the regular TikToks featuring Gwynn and Janice, and occasionally even Luis. But it didn't take long, just 5 months, for all of that to change. It was mid-December, and the three teenagers were home alone while Cruz was at his wife Lovella's school fixing some structures. Then at 2:58 p.m., he received a phone call from someone telling him go home. Do not panic. Your house was ransacked. Cruz began the frantic journey home. In the meantime, Janice, surprisingly, took to social media and began posting statuses to her Facebook page. Just 2 minutes after Cruz had received a call, Janice posted the following: Guys, help me please. Somebody entered the house. I do not want to die yet. I am inside the room hiding. Please help. And then 1 minute later, she posted again, help me. Janice's boyfriend saw the statuses and immediately called her to see what was going on. Janice answered his call, but didn't say anything. Unable to get her to respond, he hung up the phone and did nothing, apparently not concerned enough about the dire status his girlfriend had just posted to pursue it any further. Janice also messaged Lovella saying, Mama, please help. Lovella called her back, but Janice didn't answer. It was right after that Janice changed her Facebook name. She changed it from Janice Maguad to JP. Cruz arrived home within 15 minutes of receiving the alarming call. As soon as he opened the gate of their home, he encountered a blood-soaked blanket along with a knife just outside their front door. He tried to enter through that front door, but it was locked. So, he went around to the back door. He entered and quickly discovered his daughter, Gwen, bloodied, beaten, stabbed, and murdered. And then he saw of his beloved son, Luis, who had suffered the same brutal slaying, and was also hogtied and gagged. Knowing that Janice was also supposed to be home, Cruz called out for her, but she didn't respond. She emerged a few moments later, unharmed and with wet hair. Cruz initially thought she was hurt, and that her hair was wet because it was bloody. But she told him that she took a bath after the attackers left to calm herself down. Police arrived on the scene within minutes and questioned Janice about what occurred. She reported that 3 men broke into the home to rob them. They first attacked Luis and killed him. She said that she then ran into a bedroom, locked the door, and hid under the bed. Then she heard them beat and kill Gwen. Investigators diligently processed the crime scene. They immediately noted that the extreme brutality of the murders represented a level of high rage and anger by the attackers, which was not typical of a robbery. They identified broken bottles, a hammer, and a baseball bat at the scene, the latter 2 of which were determined to be the murder weapons. Both victims were bludgeoned with the bat. Gwen was also stabbed 21 times. Investigators noted at the scene that blood from her wounds had already dried up, and rigor mortis, or the stiffening of the joints that occurs after death, had set in. Ants had even already begun to ascend onto her body. Luis had been stabbed 51 times, but the blood from his wounds was still fresh, and rigor mortis had not yet set in. It would take a medical examiner a full 2 days before they could complete the autopsy, given the sheer volume and extreme extent of the siblings' wounds. It was that level of brutality that initially eliminated Janice from the radar as a suspect, with police figuring that such a seemingly innocent young girl could not possibly carry out such a heinous act. But they soon began to have their suspicions about the only survivor of this off-the-rails violent attack, and so did Cruz. For starters, after finding out that the hammer was used as a murder weapon, Cruz immediately noted that he, Gwen, and Janice were the only ones who knew where the hammer was located. He stated, also, Janice's story about hiding in the room seemed implausible since the attackers had ransacked the room she claimed she was hiding in. Given the level of disarray in the room, if she were hiding in it, she would most certainly have been discovered. Next, once the crime scene was cleared, Cruz and Lovella searched their home to try to discover exactly what the alleged robbers-turned-murderers had stolen. But the only items they found missing were the phones of their murdered children. And then there were those Facebook posts that allegedly took place in real time while the attacks were taking place. Both the public and investigators found it odd that someone under such life-threatening peril would take the time and be of the mindset to write out such an extensive message, spell it all correctly, and even include sad-faced emojis during a time that should invoke sheer terror. Even harder to believe was that during the brutal murderous attack, Janice found it the perfect time to update her Facebook name. And of course, why had Janice taken a bath? While it was possible she took the bath to calm down, as she told Cruz, the more sinister speculation was that she was cleaning herself up after the brutal slaying and washing away evidence. Overall, most people found it inconceivable that someone who feels safe enough to make themselves vulnerable in a bathtub just moments after the brutal slaying of her family members. And then there was the fact that the siblings' times of death did not at all coincide with Janice's account of the events. Given the state of Gwen's dried blood and rigor mortis, it was clear that she was killed before Luis, contrary to the account Janice gave of Luis being killed first. Lovella also noted, and found it odd, that the day of the murders was the first day that Janice had called Cruz and Lovella Mama and Papa. And others, not even close to the case, had their suspicions as well. Hearing of the brutal murder, and not pleased with the lack of media coverage or arrests, the general public began trending the hashtag Justice for Maguads siblings to place pressure on investigators. Then, taking matters into their own hands, they, along with news organizations, began researching the origins of this mysterious orphan who appeared seemingly out of nowhere. That's when it was discovered that the orphan Janice was not actually an orphan at all. They unearthed a photo taken in 2013, which is believed to have been Janice alone on a ship. Numerous people tried to help locate her family, but they were unsuccessful. Nothing was known about her life or whereabouts during the years after that photo. But what a local news did uncover afterward was that Janice's biological parents, Michelle and Juanito Cibio, were indeed alive. They had separated years ago, and Janice also had 3 other siblings. Janice had been communicating with her mother via Facebook Messenger the entire time she was living with the Maguads. Meanwhile, identification belonging to a 17-year-old male was found in Janice's room. Police called Janice in to ask her whether she knew the person depicted in the ID. To their surprise, she said yes, then proceeded to confess that she carried out the murders with the 17-year-old, who remained unnamed due to him being underage. By this time, hard evidence had also begun to come in, the most significant of which was that Janice's fingerprints matched the fingerprints on the baseball bat. Police tracked down the 17-year-old suspect and apprehended him. They found Nguyen's cell phone in his bag and learned that he and Janice had been planning the murder via Facebook Messenger for 10 days before the murder. Janice told police that she was jealous and angry of her siblings and that she murdered them for attention. And while Janice did not divulge many of the details surrounding the murders, she did divulge that at some point Nguyen managed to escape the home briefly, but she returned to save her little brother and little sister, not realizing that her little sister was behind it all. She also admitted that while she was stabbing Nguyen that Nguyen cried out, "This is just a dream. This is just a dream. I am still going to be a doctor. I don't know what wrong I did to you. Janice, I love you very much." After hearing Janice's confession, Cruz was convinced that Janice hated his daughter and wanted to take her place. He and others also recalled how Janice was obsessed with the movie The Orphan, which depicted an orphan who was adopted and tried to kill her family. The case was closed in just 6 days. And in January 2022, Janice and the 17-year-old, both minors, were charged with murder. Both killers were found guilty and sentenced to 32 years in prison, without the possibility of parole prior to then. The Maguad parents were not satisfied with the lenient sentences the killers received due to being underage. They noted that the light sentences would mean that their children's killers would walk free while they were still in their 50s, while Nguyen and Luis would remain dead. Nguyen and Luis were laid to rest in a custom gown and tuxedo. Once Janice's biological mother, Michelle, was tracked down, she shared how poverty had led her to not be able to care for her daughter. Janice's biological mother also visited the Maguad parents to apologize for the actions of her daughter. She knelt before them and apologized. The Maguads pulled her up and told her that there was no need to kneel, but asked if she could try to get Janice to give details about what happened that night. She tried, but was not allowed to see her. The Maguad parents are trying to move on from the tragic death of their beloved children. In August of 2022, they opened a restaurant called Casa M&M in remembrance of Nguyen and Luis, serving some of their favorite dishes. They attend therapy and continue to try to heal, and they take comfort in continuing to love and care for others.